Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Robert Caldwell, and I've been a park ranger for 16 years. Most people think being a ranger in North Dakota is boring. They picture me sitting in a quiet office, maybe helping lost tourists find the bathroom. They're wrong. Theodore Roosevelt National Park isn't like Yellowstone or the Grand Canyon. We don't get millions of visitors. The Badlands are harsh, lonely places. Red rock towers rise from the ground like broken teeth. Deep canyons cut through the earth like old scars. In March, when the snow melts, mud gets so thick your boots stick with every step. I love it here. Always have. Something about the way rocks tell stories that go back millions of years speaks to me. That's why I studied geology before becoming a ranger. These Badlands hold secrets older than anything humans can imagine. But in March of 1985, I learned that some secrets are better left buried. It started with phone calls from angry ranchers. Tom McKenzie called first, his voice tight with frustration. "Caldwell, something's killing my cattle," he said. "Lost 3 head this week." I grabbed my notepad. "Coyotes." "No, sir. These ain't coyote kills. Come see for yourself." I drove out to Mackenzie's place the next morning. The March air was cold and damp. Patches of snow still covered the ground in shaded spots. Mackenzie met me at his truck, wearing a heavy coat and a worried expression. "It's not pretty," he warned. He was right. The first dead cow lay in a shallow draw between 2 hills. I'd seen plenty of predator kills, but this was different. The animal had been torn apart with incredible force. Massive claw marks raked across the hide. But here's what bothered me. Most of the meat was left untouched. "See what I mean?" Mackenzie said. "Whatever did this wasn't hungry. It killed for fun." I knelt beside the carcass, measuring the claw marks with my ruler. 4 parallel gouges, each one 3 inches long and deep enough to scrape bone. The spacing was wrong for any animal I knew, too wide for a wolf, too deep for a mountain lion. "When did you find this?" I asked. "Yesterday evening. The other 2 are over that ridge." We walked to the next kill. Same story, massive trauma, little feeding. But this time I found tracks in the mud. My blood went cold when I saw them. The prints were huge, bigger than a wolf's paw, but shaped wrong for a bear. 4 toes with claw marks extending far beyond the pad. Each print was 6 inches long and pressed deep into the soft earth. Whatever made these tracks was heavy. "Jesus," Mackenzie whispered, looking over my shoulder. "What do you think it is?" I didn't answer. I was thinking about the old stories my grandfather told me. He worked these lands back in the 1920s, when it was still wild country. He used to talk about something he called the carrying off dog, a creature the Lakota people feared more than any bear or wolf. "Could be a rogue bear," I said, though I didn't believe it. "Maybe sick or injured. I'll set some cameras, do some tracking." Mackenzie nodded, but I could see he wasn't convinced either. As we walked back to his truck, he stopped and looked out over the empty Badlands. "You know, my grandfather used to tell stories about these lands, said there were things living in the deep canyons that weren't quite right, things that didn't belong in this world anymore." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the March wind. "Just stories," I said. "Maybe, but something sure as hell is out there." That afternoon, I drove back to headquarters and called my supervisor. Janet Reeves had been running the park for 8 years. She was tough, practical, and didn't have patience for anything that couldn't be solved with common sense. "Probably a bear coming out of hibernation early," she said after I described the kills. "Set some traps, maybe dart it and relocate." "Janet, I've never seen claw marks like this. And the tracks. Rob, you've been out there too long. It's a bear. Handle it." I hung up and sat in my office, staring at the photos I'd taken. The claw marks looked almost deliberate, like someone had used a giant rake on the cattle. And those tracks, they were too intelligent somehow. Bear's lumber. These prints showed purpose, planning. That evening, I drove home to my small cabin outside the park boundary. As I made dinner, I kept thinking about my grandfather's stories. He'd been a tribal liaison back when the government was still figuring out how to manage the park. He'd spent time with the Lakota elders, learning about the land. The carrying off dog wasn't just any monster, according to the stories. It was something that had survived from an older time, when the world was different. Something that remembered when these badlands were green forests and shallow seas. I tried to shake off the feeling, but as darkness fell outside my windows, I found myself checking the locks on my doors. For the first time in 16 years, I felt afraid of the land I'd devoted my life to protecting. The next morning, I loaded my truck with cameras, tranquilizer equipment, and my rifle. My dog Rex jumped into the passenger seat without being asked. He was a German Shepherd mix, smart and loyal. He'd been with me for 5 years, helping track lost hikers and keeping me company on long patrols. "What do you think, boy?" I asked, scratching his ears. "Want to go hunt some monsters?" Rex wagged his tail, but as we drove toward the Badlands, I noticed he kept looking out the windows with unusual alertness. Dogs know things we don't. I should have paid more attention to what his instincts were telling him. We were heading into country that had been wild for millions of years. Country where the rules might be different than anywhere else on Earth. Country where something that shouldn't exist might still be waiting in the deepest, darkest places. I just didn't yet, that it was waiting for me. The tracking began at dawn on Mackenzie's land, but I knew the creature wouldn't stay on ranch property. The Badlands called to predators. All those hidden canyons and caves made perfect hunting grounds. Rex and I followed the tracks south toward the Little Missouri River. The prints led us through scrub brush and around red rock formations that looked like ancient castles. Every few hundred yards, I'd stop and take pictures, measure the stride length, check for any changes. The tracks were getting fresher. In one muddy spot, I could see where water was still seeping into the deepest part of the print. We were maybe an hour behind whatever made these marks. "Easy, boy," I whispered to Rex. He'd been getting more nervous as we followed the trail. His ears stayed up, and his nose worked constantly. Every few minutes he'd whine and look back at me like he wanted to go home. The tracks led us into a narrow canyon I'd never explored before. The walls rose 60 feet on both sides, casting everything in shadow even though it was mid-morning. Water dripped from somewhere high above. The air smelled different here, older somehow, like dust from ancient graves. That's when Rex started growling. It began as a low rumble in his chest. I'd heard him growl at bears before, at aggressive tourists, at other dogs. This was different. His whole body went rigid, and the fur on his back stood straight up. He was looking at something behind us. I turned around slowly, my hand moving to the rifle slung across my shoulder. The canyon was empty, red rock walls, patches of ice in the shadows, a few scattered boulders, nothing else. But Rex kept growling, backing up against my legs. His eyes were fixed on a spot about 50 feet back up the canyon. I stared until my eyes watered, but I couldn't see anything wrong. "What is it?" I asked. As if answering, a rockessu, like the size of my fist, came rolling down the canyon wall. Then another. I looked up and saw something impossible. There were claw marks carved into the solid rock face 40 feet above the ground. 4 parallel gouges, just like the ones on Mackenzie's cattle. But these were cut into sandstone that had been hardening for millions of years. "No animal can climb sheer rock like that," I said to Rex. He disagreed. His growling got louder, and he started backing away from the canyon wall. That's when I heard it, a sound like heavy breathing coming from somewhere high above us. I raised my rifle and pointed it up toward the canyon rim, but I couldn't see anything. The breathing continued, slow and deliberate. It sounded huge, like air moving through the lungs of something the size of a horse. "Hello," I called out. Maybe it was another hiker, though I couldn't imagine how anyone could get up there. "This is Park Service. Are you hurt?" The breathing stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. Rex pressed harder against my legs, his growling now mixed with high whimpers. Every instinct I had screamed at me to get out of that canyon. I was backing toward the entrance when I heard the first howl. It started low, like a wolf's call, but it didn't stop where a wolf's would. It kept rising, getting louder and more painful to hear. The sound bounced off the canyon walls and seemed to come from everywhere at once. Rex yelped and tried to hide behind me. "It's okay," I lied, my voice shaking. "Just some animal marking territory." But I'd never heard any animal make a sound like that. It was angry and intelligent and full of a kind of hunger that made my skin crawl. We got out of the canyon fast. I didn't run. Running from predators is always a mistake. But I walked with purpose while constantly checking behind us. The howling followed us for half a mile before finally fading away. Back at headquarters, I spread out topographical maps on my desk and marked where we'd been. The canyon didn't even have a name. It was just one of hundreds of narrow cuts in the Badlands that no one ever bothered to explore. I called Janet again. "I need backup," I said. "Whatever's out there, it's not normal." "Rob, you sound spooked. Maybe you should take a few days off." "Janet, listen to me. I found claw marks on a rock wall 40 feet up. No bear, no mountain lion, nothing we know about could make those marks." There was a long pause. "Okay, I'll send Peterson out with you tomorrow. But Rob, if this turns out to be you seeing things..." "It won't." But that night at home, I started wondering if maybe Janet was right. 16 years in the wilderness could play tricks on a man's mind. Maybe I'd been alone too long. Maybe the strange shapes I'd seen in the canyon were just shadows in imagination. Rex wouldn't eat his dinner. He kept going to the windows and staring out into the darkness, his hackles raised. Every few hours he'd whine and look at me like he was trying to tell me something important. Around midnight, he started barking at the front door. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle and stepped onto the porch. The night was clear and cold, with enough moonlight to see across my small yard to the tree line beyond. Everything looked normal. Then I swept the flashlight across my truck. All 4 tires had been slashed, not punctured, slashed like someone had taken a knife to them. Except the cuts were too wide and too deep for any knife. They looked like the claw marks I'd been seeing. Rex barked harder, looking past the truck toward the trees. I followed his gaze with the flashlight beam and saw them. 2 yellow eyes reflecting back at me from the darkness. They were set wide apart and higher off the ground than any wolf's would be. "Hey!" I shouted, raising the rifle. "Get out of here!" The eyes didn't move. They just stared at me with an intelligence that made my hands shake. I fumbled for the rifle's safety, and when I looked back up, they were gone. I stood on that porch for an hour, sweeping the flashlight back and forth across my yard. Rex eventually stopped barking, but he wouldn't leave my side. When I finally went back inside, I pushed furniture in front of the door and kept the rifle next to my bed. I didn't sleep much. Every time I dozed off, I'd hear sounds outside. Footsteps that were too heavy and spaced too far apart to be human. Something was walking circles around my house, testing for weakness. The next morning, I found tracks in the mud around my truck. The same prints I'd been following in the Badlands. They led from the trees to my vehicle, then around my house twice, then back into the woods. Whatever this thing was, it had followed me home. It knew where I lived, and it was smart enough to disable my truck so I couldn't follow it back into the wilderness. Peterson arrived at 9 with a spare tire and a lot of questions I couldn't answer. He was a good ranger, 10 years younger than me and still eager to solve every problem with logic and procedure. "Probably teenagers," he said, looking at my slashed tires. "Kids from town, playing pranks." I didn't bother showing him the tracks. He'd see what he wanted to see, same as Janet. But as we drove toward the Badlands in his truck, I noticed he kept checking his mirrors and his hand stayed close to his radio. Maybe I wasn't the only one feeling watched. Peterson and I returned to the unnamed canyon with enough equipment to track an army. Cameras, motion sensors, tranquilizer guns, and emergency radios. We also brought more firepower. Peterson carried a shotgun loaded with rubber slugs, and I'd upgraded to my elk rifle with soft-point bullets. Rex stayed home. He'd refused to get in the truck that morning, something he'd never done before. When I tried to coax him, he just lay down and wouldn't move. Smart dog. "Jesus," Peterson whispered when he saw the claw marks on the canyon wall. "How'd anything get up there?" That's what I've been trying to figure out. We set up cameras at both ends of the canyon of Stalked and placed motion sensors along the game trails leading in and out. If anything bigger than a rabbit moved through this area, we'd know about it. The work took most of the morning. By noon, we'd established a monitoring grid that covered 3 square miles of badlands. Peterson seemed more convinced that we were dealing with something unusual, but he still thought in terms of known animals. Maybe it's a bear with a genetic problem, he suggested as we ate lunch on a rock outcrop overlooking the Little Missouri River. Sometimes mutations make them grow bigger, change their behavior. I nodded, but I was thinking about those yellow eyes outside my house. No bear had eyes like that. Our radios crackled with static. Janet's voice came through, broken and distant. Unit 7, checking in. Any sign of... Unit 7 here, I responded. No contact yet, still setting up equipment. Careful out there. Weather service. Flash flood warning. The radio died. I tried several times to re-establish contact, but got nothing but static. The sky was clear, but March weather in North Dakota could change fast. We should head back, Peterson said, looking at the dead radio. Another hour. I want to check the fossil beds. The fossil beds were my favorite part of the park. Ancient bones stuck out of the rock faces like pieces of a giant puzzle. Millions of years ago, this was tropical forest filled with creatures that would seem like monsters to us now. Peterson and I hiked to the largest fossil site, a cliff face where erosion had exposed layer after layer of prehistoric life. Most tourists never found this place. It was too remote, too hard to reach. That's probably why the creature had chosen it as a den. The cave opening was hidden behind a fallen boulder. I'd walked past this spot dozens of times and never noticed it. But now I could see that the boulder had been moved recently. Scratches in the rock showed where something had pushed it aside. Rob, Peterson said quietly, maybe we should call for backup before we go in there. Radio's dead, remember? The cave mouth was just wide enough for a man to crawl through. Beyond the opening, it widened into a larger chamber. I could see bones scattered on the cave floor. Recent bones, not fossils. I switched on my flashlight and crawled inside. The smell hit me first. It was the stench of death and something else, something wild and primal that made my nose burn. The cave was bigger than I'd expected, with passages leading deeper into the rock. Bones covered the floor. Not just cattle bones. I saw what looked like deer remains and smaller bones that might have been from dogs or coyotes. All of them had been cracked open, the marrow sucked out. Peterson, I called back. You need to see this. He squeezed through the opening and swept his own flashlight around the cave. Holy shit, he breathed. But the bones weren't the worst part. Along the walls, something had carved symbols into the rock. Not random scratches, deliberate patterns that looked almost like writing, spirals and slashes that seemed to tell a story I couldn't read. What animal makes symbols? Peterson asked. None that I know of. I was photographing the wall carvings when we heard it. The sound of breathing coming from deeper in the cave. Slow, steady, and much too large to be human. We both froze. My flashlight beam stretched down the main tunnel, but I couldn't see where it ended. The breathing echoed off the walls, making it impossible to tell how far back the creature was. Peterson's shotgun was already in his hands. I raised my rifle and we started backing toward the entrance. The breathing got faster, more excited. Something was moving in the darkness beyond our lights. I caught a glimpse of yellow eyes reflecting back at us. Go, I whispered. Go now. We scrambled for the cave entrance like our lives depended on it. I was almost through the opening when something roared behind us. The same set, and I'd heard in the canyon, but louder and filled with rage. A massive paw swiped at my leg as I dove through the opening. Claws raked across my boot, tearing the leather like paper. If I'd been 1 second slower, those claws would have taken my foot off. We ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. We ran across the badlands like scared children, stumbling over rocks and sliding down muddy slopes. Behind us, the roaring continued, echoing across the empty landscape. We didn't stop until we reached Peterson's truck. Both of us were breathing hard and shaking. Peterson's hands shook so bad he could barely get the key in the ignition. "What the hell was that thing?" he gasped. "I don't know, but it's not in any textbook I ever read." As we drove away, I looked back toward the fossil beds. Something was standing on the ridge above the cave, something tall and dark against the gray sky. Even from a distance, I could see it watching us leave. Back at headquarters, Janet took one look at our torn clothes and muddy faces and called in a state wildlife expert. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived the next morning with a team of specialists and enough equipment to study everything from DNA samples to territorial behavior patterns. "Describe exactly what you saw," she said, setting up a digital recorder. I told her about the cave, the bones, the symbols carved in the rock. I described the size of the creature, the intelligence in its eyes, the way it seemed to understand our weaknesses. Dr. Chen made notes and nodded professionally, but I could see the doubt in her expression. "The symbol making is interesting," she admitted. "Some higher primates do create patterns, but nothing as complex as what you're describing." This wasn't a primate. "What do you think it was?" I hesitated. "How do you tell a scientist that you think you found something that science says doesn't exist?" "I think it's something that's been hiding in these badlands for a very long time, something that survived when everything else from its era died out." Dr. Chen studied me carefully. "Mr. Caldwell, the last large predators in North America disappeared over 10,000 years ago. The idea that something like a dire wolf or short-faced bear could survive undetected is... I know how it sounds, but I know what I saw." That afternoon, Dr. Chen's team went out to collect evidence from the cave. They came back 3 hours later looking confused and worried. "The cave is empty," Dr. Chen reported. "Completely cleaned out. No bones, no carvings, nothing." I felt my stomach drop. "That's impossible." "We found the cave you described, but it looked like it had been scrubbed clean. There wasn't even any scent residue for our dogs to track." Peterson and I drove back to the fossil beds that evening. The cave was exactly as Dr. Chen had described, empty and clean as if it had never been used. Even the fallen boulder had been moved back to its original position. "It knew we'd bring others back," I said. "It cleaned up and moved on." "Animals don't think like that, Rob. This one does." That night, every motion sensor in our monitoring grid went off at the same time. The cameras captured nothing but empty landscape, but something had triggered every detector we'd placed. Whatever we were dealing with, it was smart enough to avoid our cameras while setting off our sensors. It was playing with us, showing us how easily it could move through our surveillance network without being seen. The game had changed. We weren't hunting it anymore. It was hunting us. The attack started 3 days later. Mackenzie's neighbor, old Bill Hartley, found his prize bull dead in a pasture half a mile from his house. The animal had been killed with the same massive claw marks, but this time there was something different. The bull was arranged in a deliberate pattern, legs positioned to point toward Hartley's house like an arrow. "It's sending a message," I told Janet over the radio, "letting us know it can kill anywhere, anytime." "Rob, you're starting to sound paranoid." Maybe I was, but paranoid was better than dead. Dr. Chen's team had been in the field for a week without finding any solid evidence. The creature stayed ahead of them, always one step smarter than their best efforts. But I could feel it out there, watching and waiting. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Joseph Running Bear was a member of the local Lakota Nation and worked part-time at the park's visitor center. He was in his 70s, quiet and thoughtful, with deep knowledge of the traditional stories. I'd known him for years but never talked to him about the creature. He approached me after hearing about the latest cattle killing. "You're dealing with Shunka Warakin," he said simply. I'd heard the name before in my grandfather's stories. The carrying off dog. That's one translation. It means the one that carries things off into the darkness. My grandfather saw one in 1924, said it was hunting in the breaks along the river. Joseph and I sat in my office while he told me the old stories. According to Lakota tradition, the Shunka Warakin were ancient predators that survived the Great Dying that killed the mammoths and giant bears. They were smart enough to hide in the deepest places, patient enough to wait until the world forgot they existed. They're not just animals, Joseph explained. They remember the old times when they ruled these lands, and they don't like sharing. How do you kill one? Joseph shook his head. You don't. You appease it or you wait for it to leave. But this one won't leave on its own. Why not? Because you found its cubs. The pieces clicked together. The cave, the bones, the territorial behavior. The creature wasn't just hunting, it was protecting young. That's why it had cleaned out the cave and moved them. That's why it was escalating the attacks. Where would it take them? I asked. Joseph thought for a moment. Somewhere high and hidden. Somewhere it could see enemies coming from all directions. He paused. There's a place my people avoided, even in the old days. We called it the Watchful Place. If the Shunkawarakin is still here, that's where it would go. He gave me directions to a remote canyon system in the northern section of the park. It was federal land, but so isolated that even rangers rarely went there. The perfect place for something to hide. I left Peterson at headquarters and drove out alone. After what happened at the cave, I didn't want to risk anyone else's life. If this creature was protecting cubs, it would fight to the death rather than retreat. The Watchful Place was everything Joseph had described. A narrow canyon wound back into the Badlands for almost a mile before opening into a hidden valley. Rock towers rose on all sides like giant sentries, and the only way in or out was through the canyon entrance. I parked my truck and went the rest of the way on foot, my rifle ready and every sense alert. The silence was complete. No birds, no insects, no wind. Even my footsteps seemed too loud. The valley floor was covered with bones, not scattered like in the cave, but arranged in careful patterns, spirals and lines that looked like the symbols I'd seen carved in the cave walls. The creature was using bones to write messages I couldn't understand. At the far end of the valley, a rock formation created a natural shelter. I could see something moving in the shadows, small shapes that tumbled and played like puppies. Cubs. 3 of them. No bigger than German shepherds, but already showing the massive paws and intelligent eyes of their parent. They were beautiful and terrifying at the same time. I was so focused on the cubs that I didn't hear the adult approaching until it was too late. The attack came from above. The creature had climbed the canyon wall and positioned itself on a ledge directly over my head. It dropped down behind me with enough force to crack the rocks when, it landed. I spun around and got my first clear look at the Shunkawarakin. It was bigger than I'd imagined. 7 feet long and built like a wolf crossed with a bear. Its fur was dark gray, almost black, and its muscles moved under the skin like steel cables. But it was the eyes that froze my blood. They were yellow like a wolf's, but filled with an intelligence that was almost human. Those eyes studied me with the same intensity I'd used to examine a rock sample. The creature was analyzing me, figuring out my strengths and weaknesses, planning its attack. I raised my rifle, but the Shunkawarakin was already moving. It covered 20 feet in a single leap, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. I got one shot off before it hit me. The bullet caught it in the shoulder, spinning it around but not slowing it down. Massive claws raked across my chest, shredding my jacket and leaving burning lines across my ribs. The impact knocked me backward into a pile of arranged bones. I rolled away as the creature landed where I'd been standing. Its claws left gouges in the solid rock. I scrambled for my rifle, but the Shunkawarakin was between me and the weapon. It could have killed me then. Should have killed me. Instead, it sat back on its haunches and studied me again. Blood ran from the bullet wound in its shoulder, but it seemed more curious than angry. Easy, I whispered, the way I'd talk to a spooked horse. I'm not here to hurt your babies. The creature tilted its head, and for a moment I thought it understood. Then it opened its mouth and made a sound I'll never forget. A low rumble that was part growl, part words in a language no human had ever heard. Behind it, the cubs had stopped playing and were watching us with the same intense intelligence as their parent. 3 generations of survival instincts told them I was a threat that needed to be eliminated. The adult Shunkawarakin rose to its full height and took a step toward me. I was out of options. No weapon, no escape route, and no way to convince an ancient predator that I meant no harm. That's when the flash flood hit. The March thaw had been feeding water into the canyons for weeks. Somewhere upstream, a natural dam of ice and debris had finally burst. A wall of muddy water 6 feet high roared down the narrow canyon like a freight train. The Shunka Warakan heard it first. Its ears swiveled toward the canyon entrance and its eyes went wide. It barked something to its cubs, a sharp, urgent command that sent them scrambling up the rock walls to safety. I had maybe 10 seconds before the flood reached the valley. I ran for the nearest rock tower and started climbing, my boots slipping on the wet stone. Behind me, I could hear the water getting closer, carrying boulders and tree trunks with the sound of a landslide. The flood hit just as I pulled myself onto a narrow ledge 20 feet above the valley floor. Water filled the hidden valley in seconds, turning it into a churning lake. The carefully arranged bone patterns disappeared under the brown current. Across the valley, I could see the adult Shunka Warakin clinging to another rock face. Our eyes met over the floodwater, and I saw something unexpected in its gaze. Respect. We were both survivors, both creatures who understood the harsh rules of the wilderness. The flood lasted for 2 hours. When the water finally receded, the valley looked completely different. The bone patterns were gone, washed away along with any evidence that the Shunka Warakan family had ever been there. I climbed down from my ledge on shaking legs. My rifle was buried somewhere under tons of mud and debris. The creature and its cubs were gone, vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. But as I walked back toward the canyon entrance, I found something in the mud, a single paw print, perfectly preserved in the soft earth. It was smaller than the adult's tracks, probably from one of the cubs. I left it there. Some things are meant to stay hidden. The official report blamed the cattle killings on a rogue bear that had since moved on to different territory. Dr. Chen's team found no evidence of any unusual predator activity, and the case was officially closed. I didn't argue. Sometimes the truth is less important than keeping people safe. The watchful place was declared geologically unstable after the flash flood. Warning signs went up at the canyon entrance, and the area was closed to public access indefinitely. Park Service maps were updated to show the region as impassable terrain. Joseph Running Bear nodded approvingly when he heard about the closure. "Good," he said. "Some places should stay empty." I requested a transfer to a desk job a month later. Janet approved it without question. I think she was worried about my mental state after spending so much time in the field alone. I became the park's geological survey coordinator, a position that kept me in the office reviewing rock samples and updating topographical maps. I never went back to the Badlands. Rex eventually got over his fear and returned to normal, though he never liked riding in the truck toward the northern sections of the park. Dogs remember things we try to forget. Peterson left the service 6 months later and became a town cop in Fargo. We kept in touch for a while, but we never talked about what happened in that cave. Some experiences are too big for words. 3 years later, I was reviewing satellite photos for a geological survey when I noticed something interesting. The photos showed the watchful place from above, and if you looked carefully, you could see patterns in the rock formations, spiral arrangements and straight lines that looked almost deliberate. Maybe erosion creates patterns like that. Maybe wind and water carve rocks into shapes that look meaningful when they're reorient. Ally, just random. But I've been studying geology for 20 years, and I've never seen erosion work quite like that. I keep those photos in a locked filing cabinet in my office. Sometimes, late at night when I'm working alone, I take them out and study the patterns. They remind me that the world is bigger and stranger than our textbooks admit. Last month, a rancher from the Pine Ridge area called to report unusual cattle killings. The description sounded familiar. Massive claw marks, little feeding, kills that seemed motivated by something other than hunger. I took the message and filed it away. Let someone else handle it. I've done my time fighting monsters in the wilderness. But sometimes, when the wind is right and I'm driving home past the Badlands, I roll down my windows and listen to the night sounds. Most of the time, it's just coyotes and owls, the ordinary music of the prairie. But once in a while, I hear something else. A howl that starts low and rises until it seems to fill the whole sky. A sound that speaks of ancient hungers and long memories. When I hear that sound, I drive a little faster and check my locks twice before going to bed. Because I know what's out there in the deep places where humans rarely go. I know that some things survived when everything else died, patient and hidden and waiting for the world to forget they exist. The Shunkawarakian is still out there. Maybe not in the watchful place. That's been disturbed now, made unsafe by human attention. But somewhere in the millions of acres of badlands, in canyons that don't appear on any map, the carrying off dog continues its ancient hunt. And maybe that's how it should be. The world needs its mysteries, its dark corners where impossible things can still exist. We've explained away too much already, mapped and cataloged every square mile of Earth until there's no room left for wonder. The Badlands remember what we've forgotten, that we're not alone on this planet, and we never were. There are older rules than the ones in our books, older hungers than the ones we understand. I've kept that knowledge for 5 years now, carried it like a weight in my chest. Most days, I can pretend it doesn't matter, that I'm just a normal man with a normal job in a normal world. But on quiet nights when I hear that distant howling, I remember the yellow eyes watching me from the darkness. I remember the intelligence behind those eyes, patient and calculating and utterly alien. And I'm grateful that something wild still exists in the world, something that refuses to be tamed or explained or forgotten, even if it scares me to death. My name is Robert Caldwell, and I've seen things that aren't supposed to exist. I've looked into the eyes of something that should have died out 10,000 years ago, and I've lived to tell about it. The question is whether My name is Michael Brennan, and I've been a forest ranger for 19 years. I've seen bears attack campers, watched people fall off cliffs, and pulled bodies out of rivers. But what I found in those caves in November 1991 changed everything I thought I knew about what lives under our feet. I work the Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky, specifically the Red River Gorge area. My specialty is cave systems and underground resources. I've mapped more caves in this region than anyone else alive. I know every tunnel, every drop, every tight squeeze from here to the Tennessee border. At least I thought I did. The weather that November was all wrong. We had temperatures in the 70s when it should have been freezing. All that warm rain was causing problems underground, flooding caves that hadn't seen water in decades, opening new passages, changing the whole layout of systems we thought we knew by heart. That's when the cavers went missing. 3 college kids from the University of Kentucky, Sarah Chen, Marcus Williams, and David Park. They were part of the school's spelunking club, experienced enough to know better than to go into unmapped caves. But they'd heard about a new system that opened up after the flooding, something the locals were calling Devil's Throat. The local stories about that area went back generations. My grandfather, who worked these mountains as a logger, used to tell me about the hollow men, pale things that lived deep underground and came up to steal people away. He said they could walk through solid rock like it was air, that they'd been taking folks from these hills for centuries. I always figured it was just mountain folklore, stories to keep kids from wandering too deep into dangerous cave systems. Now I'm not so sure. When the kids didn't return after 3 days, the university called us. Their car was still parked at the trailhead, their equipment gone. We found the cave entrance about 2 miles in, a narrow slot in the limestone that dropped straight down into darkness. Fresh rope was anchored to a tree, disappearing into the black. I should have called for backup right then, should have waited for a full cave rescue team, but those kids had been down there 3 days without food or water, and time was running out. I assembled a small team, Rodriguez from the Park Service, good climber, steady head, Jennifer Walsh from the County Rescue Squad, paramedic training, 10 years of cave rescue, and Tom Bradley, local volunteer, knew these mountains better than anyone. 4 of us total, all experienced, all equipped with proper gear. We went down at dawn on November 15th. I remember the date because it was my daughter's birthday, and I'd promised to be home for dinner. I keep a photo of her in my helmet. She was turning 8 that day, gap-toothed smile, holding a fishing rod almost as big as she was. The rope dropped 30 feet into a chamber the size of a basketball court. Our headlamps carved out circles of yellow light in the darkness, revealing flowstone formations and pools of standing water. The air smelled wrong, not the clean limestone smell of most caves, but something organic, like mushrooms left to rot. "Jesus, it's warm in here," Rodriguez said, pulling off his jacket. He was right. Most caves in Kentucky stay around 55 degrees year-round, but this felt more like 70. Walsh was checking her equipment. "Radio's dead, just static." She tapped the unit against her helmet. "Must be the limestone interfering with the signal." That should have been our second warning. We found the first sign of the missing cavers about 100 feet in. Sarah's headlamp, cracked and dark, sitting on a ledge like someone had carefully placed it there. No sign of Sarah herself. They kept on. "Me this way," Bradley said, pointing to scuff marks on the cave floor. 3 sets of boot prints, heading deeper. The tunnel narrowed as we went, forcing us to move single file. My compass started acting strange, the needle spinning slowly, never settling on magnetic north. I'd seen this before in caves with high iron content, but something about it felt different this time. We'd been underground for 2 hours when Rodriguez started having problems. "The walls," he said, pressing his hand against the limestone. "They're moving." I played my light over the surface. It looked normal to me. Smooth flowstone with the usual mineral deposits. "What do you mean, moving?" "Like breathing, in and out." His voice was tight, stressed. "You don't see it?" Walsh and I exchanged glances. Cave madness wasn't uncommon. The darkness, the enclosed spaces, the disorientation could play tricks on anyone's mind. But Rodriguez was solid, experienced. If he was seeing things, we had a problem. "Let's take a break," I said. "Eat something, check our gear." We sat in a wider chamber, sharing energy bars and water. The silence was absolute except for the steady drip of water somewhere in the darkness beyond our lights. I'd been in thousands of caves, but this one felt different. It felt alive. That's when we heard the screaming. The sound came from deeper in the cave system. High-pitched, desperate, echoing off the stone walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Human screaming, no doubt about it. "Sarah!" Walsh called out, her voice bouncing back to us in overlapping echoes. The screaming stopped. We moved faster now, following the main passage as it sloped downward into the mountain's heart. The temperature kept rising, and our lights revealed something that made my blood go cold. Scratch marks on the walls. Not random gouges, but deliberate patterns, like some kind of primitive writing. "Those aren't natural," Bradley whispered, running his fingers over the marks. "Someone carved these, but with what? They go deep into the stone." The markings covered the L's in spiraling patterns that hurt to look at directly. They seemed to shift and move in our peripheral vision, though when I focused my light on them, they stayed still. Rodriguez was getting worse. He kept stopping to touch the walls, claiming he could feel them pulse like a heartbeat. His breathing was rapid and shallow, the beginning of a panic attack. "Michael," he grabbed my arm, "we need to get out of here. This place, it's not natural. There's something wrong with the stone itself." Before I could respond, we found Marcus. He was sitting in a side chamber back against the wall, legs stretched out in front of him. At first glance, he looked like he was resting. But when Walsh played her light over him, we saw the truth. His eyes were gone. Not just missing. The sockets were perfectly smooth, as if he'd never had eyes at all. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and when Walsh checked for a pulse, her hand came away covered in fine white dust. "He's been dead for days," she said, but her voice was uncertain. "The body, it's not decomposing right. It's turning to stone." I'd seen bodies in caves before. Usually the cool temperature and stable environment preserved them well, but this was different. Marcus looked like he was becoming part of the cave itself, slowly transforming into limestone. That's when I noticed the breathing, soft, rhythmic, coming from deeper in the chamber. We followed the sound and found a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. The breathing was coming from inside. "Sarah? David?" I called. The breathing stopped. "We're park rangers," Walsh added. "We're here to help." A whisper came back to us, so quiet I almost missed it. "Run." It was Sarah's voice, but wrong somehow. Hollow, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. I was about to crawl into the passage when Rodriguez screamed. I spun around to find him pressed against the wall, staring at something I couldn't see. "They're coming through," he shouted. "They're coming through the stone." The wall behind him began to ripple like water. The solid limestone surface moved and flowed, and something pale pushed through it. An arm, thin and elongated, with fingers too long to be human. Then a head, hairless and white, with eyes like black pools. It wasn't quite human. The proportions were wrong. Limbs too long, torso too narrow, skull elongated like it had been stretched. But the worst part was how it moved through the solid rock like it was liquid, emerging from the stone as easily as stepping through a doorway. Rodriguez tried to run, but another arm shot out of the wall and grabbed him around the waist. He clawed at the stone, screaming as he was pulled backward into what should have been solid limestone. I fumbled for my radio, forgetting it was dead. Bradley had his pistol out, but what do you shoot at something that can move through rock? Walsh was backing toward the tunnel entrance, her light dancing wildly as her hands shook. More shapes moved in the stone around us. The walls themselves seemed alive now, flowing and shifting as pale forms pressed against them from the other side. I could see faces in the limestone, human faces, twisted in silent screams. "The rope!" I shouted. "Get to the rope!" We ran through tunnels that changed behind us. Passages that had been open when we came through were now sealed with solid stone. New openings appeared where walls had been solid moments before. Our lights carved chaotic paths through the darkness as we stumbled over loose rock and splashed through pools of standing water. Behind us, Rodriguez was still screaming. The sound grew fainter and more distorted, as if he was being dragged deeper and deeper into the stone itself. We reached a chamber I didn't recognize. The walls were covered in those same spiral carvings, but now they pulsed with a faint phosphorescent light. In the center of the room stood a figure, tall, pale, with those same ilonga. Ted proportions as the thing that had taken Rodriguez. It spoke without moving its mouth, the words seeming to come from the stone itself. "You walk in our feeding grounds." Walsh raised her light toward it, but the beam passed through its body as if it wasn't entirely there. It was solid enough to speak, but not solid enough to be properly illuminated. "What are you?" I managed to ask. "We are the hollow ones. We are the stone that hungers." It gestured to the walls around us. "Your kind feeds us well. Your fear makes the meat tender." The carvings on the walls began to move faster, spiraling inward like a whirlpool. I realized they weren't decorations at all. They were a map of every tunnel, every chamber, every passage in the cave system. And at the center was a large chamber marked with symbols that looked like bones. "The feeding ground," it said, following my gaze. "Where we prepare the harvest. Your friend waits for you there." Bradley fired his pistol. The bullet passed through the creature and struck the wall behind it, sending chips of limestone flying. The creature smiled, the first recognizably human expression I'd seen from it. "Iron and fire," it said. "Your ancestors knew these things could hurt us. But you have forgotten so much." That's when I remembered my acetylene torch. I fired up the torch without thinking, sending a blue-white flame roaring into the darkness. The creature recoiled, its form becoming more solid, more real. The phosphorescent glow in the walls dimmed, and for a moment the carvings stopped moving. "Fire!" it hissed, backing away from the flame. "The Sunbringer." "Walsh, Bradley, stay behind me," I said, keeping the torch between us and the creature. "It doesn't like the fire." We backed toward what looked like the tunnel we'd come from, but the passage had changed. The walls were different, covered with more of those rail carvings. Our map was useless now. The cave system was rewriting itself around us. The creature followed at a distance, just outside the torch's reach. Others moved in the walls around, us pale shapes pressing against the stone like swimmers trapped under ice. "Where are Sarah and David?" Walsh demanded. The creature tilted its head. "The female ceased struggling 2 days ago. She rests in the feeding chamber, becoming part of our bounty. The male still fights. His fear seasons him well." We emerged into a larger chamber, and I nearly dropped the torch. The walls were lined with alcoves, each one containing a human figure in various stages of transformation. Some were recent. I could still see clothing, recognize faces. Others were older, their features worn smooth by centuries of slow change into stone. In the center of the chamber was David Park. He was alive, but changed. His skin had the same translucent quality as Marcus's, and his eyes were starting to cloud over. He was chained to the floor with what looked like chains made of living stone, growing up from the cave floor itself. "David!" Walsh called out. He turned toward us, and when he spoke, his voice was thick and slurred. It's inside me, in my bones, changing me from the inside." Around the chamber, other figures stirred. Some I recognized from missing person reports going back years. Others were older, their clothing from different eras. A woman in a 1950s dress. A man in what looked like Civil War-era clothes. Some wore the buckskin and homespun of early settlers. They'd been feeding on people for centuries, taking them, changing them slowly, keeping them alive while they transformed into something between human and stone. "The process takes time," the creature explained, moving around the edge of the flame's reach. "Fear and pain improve the final product. Your friend will feed us for decades before the change is complete." More creatures emerged from the walls, dozens of them, all with that same pale, elongated appearance. Some were more solid than others, as if they exist, and at different levels of reality. The older ones seemed more integrated with the stone, while the newer ones were more recognizably human in their proportions. "We are the mountain's children," one of them said, "born from the deep places where stone and flesh become one. Your kind trespasses in our realm." I swept the torch in a wide arc, keeping them back. The flame was starting to run low. I had maybe 20 minutes of fuel left. After that, we'd be defenseless. Bradley was checking his ammunition. "I've got maybe 15 rounds left. Walsh?" "No weapon, just my medical kit." She was looking at David, calculating. "Michael, we can't carry him out of here. The stone chains, they're growing into his legs." She was right. The chains weren't just restraining David. They were becoming part of him, growing through his flesh like some kind of mineral parasite. "Please," David whispered. "Don't leave me here. I can feel them in my head, showing me what I'm going to become." The creatures were getting braver, pressing closer despite the flame. I could see more of them moving in the walls, an army of pale shapes waiting for my torch to burn out. That's when I heard Rodriguez again. His voice came from the walls themselves, distorted and echoing. "Michael, help me. I'm still alive. They're keeping me alive." I followed the sound to a section of wall that looked different from the others. Instead of solid limestone, it was more like a membrane, translucent and pulsing. I could see shapes moving inside it. Human shapes, trapped in the stone like insects in amber. Rodriguez was there, his mouth open in a silent scream. Next to him was Sarah Chen, her eyes wide with terror. And there were others. Dozens of others, all trapped in the living stone. "The stone grows around them," the original creature explained. "Preserves them. They feel everything but can do nothing. Their fear feeds us for generations." Walsh grabbed my arm. "We have to get out of here, now, before the torch runs out." But the creatures had sealed off all the exits. Every tunnel, every passage, every crack was blocked by solid stone. We were trapped in the feeding chamber with no way out. That's when I noticed something. The spiral carvings on the walls. They weren't just decorative. They were some kind of control system. When the creatures moved through the stone, the spirals would light up and shift, directing the flow of the living rock. The carvings, I said. They control the cave system. Bradley followed my gaze. You think if we damage them? Maybe. It's worth a try. I directed the torch toward the nearest set of carvings. The flame licked at the stone, and the phosphorescent glow began to flicker. The creatures shrieked, a sound like breaking glass. "Stop!" the lead creature commanded. "You do not understand what you are doing." But I did understand. The carvings weren't just controls. They were the creature's connection to the stone itself. Damage them enough, and maybe the walls would stop obeying their commands. I played the flame over more of the carvings, watching them crack and darken under the heat. The creatures pressed closer, desperate now, but the fire still held them back. The walls began to shudder. Chunks of limestone fell from the ceiling, and I heard the sound of stone grinding against stone. Somewhere in the distance, Rodriguez's screaming grew louder. "The mountain grows angry," one of the creatures warned. "You will bring the deep places down on all of us." Maybe that wasn't such a bad idea. I swept the torch across more carvings, watching them blacken and crack under the flame. Each damaged symbol made the creatures more desperate, more solid. They were losing their connection to the stone, becoming trapped in physical form. "You fool!" the lead creature snarled, now solid enough that Bradley's bullets might actually hit it. "The bindings have held for 1,000 years. You do not know what you unleash." The walls groaned and shifted. The membrane holding Rodriguez and the others began to crack, and I heard voices, human voices, gasping as if they were taking their first breath in years. "The stone prison is breaking," Walsh said, staring at the wall. "They're still alive in there." That's when I understood the full horror of what these things had been doing. They weren't just killing people. They were keeping them conscious, aware, trapped in living stone for decades or centuries, feeding on their terror and despair while their bodies slowly transformed into something between human and mineral. "How long?" I demanded, turning to the lead creature. "How long have you been doing this?" It smiled, showing teeth like broken limestone. "Since the first humans came to these mountains. We are older than your stories, older than your gods. We were here when the stone was young." More carvings cracked under the torch's heat. The creature's form wavered, becoming less solid. Around the chamber, the trapped figures in the walls began to move, pressing against their stone prisons from the inside. "Michael!" Rodriguez's voice came clearly now from the wall behind me. "The explosives! In my pack!" I'd forgotten. Rodriguez always carried a small amount of C4 for clearing rockfalls and blocked passages. If his pack was still with him in the stone... "Where's your pack?" I called. "On my back. I can reach it, but I can't move my arms. You have to get me out." The torch flame was getting smaller. I had maybe 5 minutes of fuel left. After that, we'd be at the creature's mercy. I played the fire over the section of wall where Rodriguez was trapped, heating the stone until it glowed dull red. The limestone began to crack and flake away, and Rodriguez's hand pushed through. "Got it." He held up a small block of plastic explosive and a detonator. "But we need to get clear. This whole burr will come down." The creatures realized what was happening. They rushed us all at once, no longer afraid of the dying flame. Bradley opened fire, his bullets passing through some of them but striking others solidly. The more damaged their wall carvings were, the more physical they became. Walsh was working to free David, but the stone chains had grown too deep into his legs. "I can't get him loose," she said. "The rock is fused with his bones." David looked up at us with clouding eyes. "Just go. Don't let this happen to anyone else." "No!" I played the torch over his stone restraints, but the flame was too weak now. "We're not leaving you." "You have to." His voice was getting weaker. "I can feel them in my head. They're showing me the others they've taken, the ones still trapped in the deep places. Hundreds of them, Michael. Hundreds." The creatures pressed closer. My torch flickered and went out. In the sudden darkness, Rodriguez set off the explosive. The sound was deafening. The chamber shook and chunks of limestone rained down from the ceiling. I felt the floor crack beneath my feet, and suddenly we were falling, tumbling down through broken stone into the depths below. I landed hard on a pile of rubble. My flashlight cracked but still working. Around me I could hear Walsh and Bradley groaning, alive but hurt. The air was thick with limestone dust and the smell of cordite. Above us, the feeding chamber was completely collapsed. David was buried under tons of rock, finally free from his stone chains. The creature's screams echoed through the cave system as their control carvings were destroyed. But we weren't safe yet. The explosion had opened new passages, revealing chambers that had been sealed for centuries. And from the depths below came a sound that made my blood freeze, the scraping of claws on stone, growing closer. "Something's coming up from below," Bradley whispered, blood running from a cut on his forehead. I played my light down the new passage. The beam revealed smooth walls covered in more of those spiral carvings. But these were older, more complex. And moving toward us through the tunnel was something that made the other creatures look almost human by comparison. It was huge, maybe 8 feet tall, with limbs like twisted tree branches, and a head that was more stone than flesh. Its eyes were deep pits in its skull, and when it spoke, the sound came from the cave walls themselves. "Children," it said. "Foolish children. You have awakened the deep mother." This was the source, the thing the others served, the creature that had been turning people into stone for 1,000 years. "The mountain hungers," it continued, moving closer. "And you have freed its appetite from the small chambers above. Now it will feed on the world above." Through the cracks in the collapsed ceiling, I could see the night sky. But it was changing, the stars flickering and going out one by one. The corruption was spreading upward, turning the living world into an extension of the stone realm below. I had one last idea. In my pack, I carried flares for cave emergencies, magnesium flares that burned white-hot for 20 minutes. If fire could hurt these things. I lit the first flare and threw it at the creature's feet. It screamed and recoiled, its stone flesh cracking where the burning magnesium landed. The light was brilliant in the darkness, turning the cave walls stark white. "Walsh, Bradley, the rope to the surface, is the passage still open?" Walsh looked up through the debris. "I think so, but we'd have to climb past that thing." The creature was backing away from the flare, but there were others coming. I could hear them moving through the stone walls, converging on our position. I lit 2 more flares and handed one each to Walsh and Bradley. "These things hate the light. We run for the rope, and we don't stop for anything." We ran through tunnels lit by brilliant white fire, the creatures shrieking and recoiling from our flares. Behind us, the deep mother's voice echoed through the stone. "You cannot escape the mountain's hunger. It follows you now. It knows your scent." The rope was still there, hanging down from the entrance 30 feet above, but climbing it with injured hands while carrying flares would be almost impossible. "I'll go first," I said. "Pull the rope up behind me so they can't follow." "What about Rodriguez?" Walsh asked. "He's still alive in there." I looked back at the collapsed chamber. Somewhere in that mass of broken stone, Rodriguez was buried. Still conscious, still aware, becoming part of the mountain's appetite. "He's gone," I said. "We can't save him now." We climbed in the blazing light of the flares, the creatures pressing up from below but unable to follow. Behind us, the spiral carvings on the walls began to glow again, and I knew the damage we'd done was only temporary. At the surface, we sealed the cave entrance with the rest of Rodriguez's explosives. The blast brought down half the hillside, burying the shaft under thousands of tons of rock. But even as we drove away, I could feel something following us. The corruption was spreading through the underground limestone network, seeking new ways to the surface. I wrote the official report 3 days later. Structural collapse due to recent flooding. 4 casualties, 3 missing cavers, and 1 Park Service employee lost in a rescue attempt. The cave system was declared too unstable for further exploration and permanently closed to the public. Nobody questioned the report. Nobody wanted to dig too deeply into what had really happened down there. Walsh and Bradley backed up my story without hesitation. We'd all seen what lived in those tunnels, and we all knew it was better left buried. But the nightmares started immediately. Every night, I'd dream about Rodriguez trapped in the stone, still conscious, still aware. I'd see Sarah and David and all the others, their faces pressed against translucent walls, screaming silently while something ancient fed on their terror. The worst part was knowing they were still down there. The explosion had collapsed the feeding chamber, but the creatures were older than recorded history. They'd survived ice ages and geological upheavals. A few tons of broken limestone wouldn't stop them for long. 3 weeks after the incident, I requested a transfer to Death Valley National Park. Desert country, no caves, no underground water systems. As far from Kentucky limestone as I could get while still doing the job I knew. My supervisor thought it was survivor's guilt, post-traumatic stress from losing Rodriguez and failing to save the missing cavers. He approved the transfer and recommended counseling, which I declined. How do you explain to a psychiatrist that you've seen people being digested by living stone? But even in the desert, I couldn't escape what I'd learned. I started researching missing person cases in limestone regions, looking for patterns. What I found kept me awake at night. Mammoth Cave, Kentucky. Dozens of people vanished over the decades, their bodies never found. Carlsbad Caverns, New Mexico. Similar stories going back to the Apache legends of things that lived in the deep places. The Ozark Mountains, Tennessee caves, Pennsylvania limestone country. Everywhere there were extensive cave systems. There were stories of people who went underground and never came back. The Hollow Men, the Stone Eaters, the Deep Mothers. Different names for the same things. Creatures that had been feeding on human fear and flesh for millennia, turning their victims into living extensions of the cave systems themselves. 6 months after my transfer, I got a call from Walsh. She was still in Kentucky, still working search and rescue, but something in her voice told me she wasn't calling with good news. "Michael," she said, "we've got a problem. That cave system you sealed, it's opened up again. Different entrant, just about 2 miles south of the original site, and we've got 3 more missing persons." I wasn't surprised. The creatures were patient, ancient, and adaptable. They'd found new ways to the surface, new hunting grounds. The mountain's hunger was too old and too deep to be stopped by a few explosives. "Are you going in?" I asked. "I have to. It's my job." She paused. "But I wanted you to know, in case something happens to me." That was 2 years ago. Walsh never came back from that cave. Neither did the backup team they sent after her. The official report blamed another structural collapse, and the new entrance was sealed as well. But I know better. The thing we awakened down there, the Deep Mother, is still growing, still spreading through the limestone networks that run under half the continent, still turning people into conscious stone, feeding on their trapped awareness while their bodies become part of the mountain itself. Sometimes, late at night in my desert trailer, I can hear them. Voices carried on the wind from 2,000 miles away, calling my name. Rodriguez's voice, mostly, but sometimes Walsh, sometimes Sarah and David and all the others. They want me to come back. They want me to join them in their stone prison, where the fear never ends and the pain just goes on forever. I keep my radio turned up loud to drown them out. I sleep with all the lights on, and I stay far, far away from anywhere with caves. But I know it's only a matter of time. The mountain remembers my scent, like the Deep Mother said, and the mountain's hunger is patient. Last week I found limestone formations in Death Valley that weren't on any geological survey. Small caves, barely big enough to crawl through, but they're there. New ones appear every few days, and I can smell that familiar organic rot drifting up from their depths. They're following me, following the connection I made when I damaged their carvings, when I freed some of their prisoners. I'm marked now, tagged for harvest. I could run again, transfer to Alaska, maybe, or Hawaii, somewhere without Lee, Mestone Caves. But what's the point? They've had 1,000 years to spread through the underground networks. By now, they're probably everywhere. So I wait. I do my job, patrol the desert, help lost hikers, write reports about coyotes and rattlesnakes. Normal things. Safe things. But every night, I check the locks on my trailer and listen to the wind carry voices from the deep places. They're patient, but they're also hungry. And eventually, everyone has to sleep. My name is James Whitmore, and I've been a forest ranger for 17 years. I'm telling you this story because I need someone to know what really happened up at Coffin Rock in August of 1979. The Forest Service says it was just a wildfire that got out of hand. They're wrong. I work the Mount St. Helens area of Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington State. Beautiful country most of the time. Dense woods, clear streams, and mountains that make you feel small in a good way. I've walked these trails longer than some folks have been alive. Used to be a logger before this job until my brother Danny got crushed by a widowmaker. That's what we called dead trees that could fall without warning. After that happened, I couldn't stand the sound of chainsaws anymore. Being a ranger suited me better anyway. I like the quiet. Just me and my German Shepherd Rex keeping an eye on things. My job is mostly fire prevention and patrol work. Check the campgrounds, make sure hikers aren't being stupid with their campfires, watch for trouble. In 17 years, I thought I'd seen every kind of trouble these woods could throw at me. That August was hotter than hell and dry as old bones. We hadn't seen rain in 6 weeks. Every morning I'd check the fire danger signs, and every morning they stayed at extreme risk. The whole forest felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for one spark to set it all off. Sheriff Murphy called me on a Tuesday morning. His voice sounded tired through the radio static. "Jimmy, I need you to take a look at something out near the Packwood boundary. Had 3 ranchers call in about livestock kills. Strange ones. I'd dealt with bear attacks before, even a few cougar kills." "What makes these strange, Sheriff?" "You'll see when you get there. Meet me at the Hendricks Ranch around noon." The drive out to Hendricks' place took me through some of the pure Eddie's country in Washington. Rolling hills covered in Douglas fir with Mount Rainier standing watch in the distance. But as I got closer to the ranch, something felt off. Rex started whining in the back seat, which wasn't like him. He was a steady dog, calm as they come. Sheriff Murphy was already there when I pulled up, talking to old Frank Hendricks by the barn. Frank looked like he'd aged 10 years since I'd seen him last spring. "Jimmy, thank God you're here," Frank said, shaking my hand. "Lost 3 head of cattle in the last week. But this ain't no bear or cougar doing this." Murphy nodded toward the pasture. "Take a look and tell me what you think." The first thing that hit me was the smell. Death has its own scent, and it was thick in the hot air. But there was something else underneath it. Something wild and musky that made the hair on my neck stand up. The cow was a big Hereford, probably 800 pounds, or had been. Now it was scattered across about 20 yards of pasture, not torn apart randomly like a bear would do, but arranged. That's the only word for it. The bones were laid out in neat piles. The hide was folded and placed to one side, almost careful-like. "Jesus," I whispered. "Gets worse," Murphy said. He led me to a patch of soft earth near the creek. "Look at these tracks." I knelt down and felt my blood go cold. The tracks started off human, clear toe marks, the arch of a foot, about size 14 by my guess. But 20 feet later, they changed. The human prints became something else. Longer, with claw marks. 4 toes instead of 5. And they were deep. Whatever made them was heavy. "What kind of animal makes tracks like that?" Frank asked. I couldn't answer him. In 17 years of working these woods, I'd never seen anything like it. The tracks seemed to show something walking upright on 2 legs, then dropping down to run, on 4. But that was impossible. "Could be a hoax," I said, but even I didn't believe it. No one could fake the way those tracks changed from human to animal. The depth was all wrong for Borat, someone just pressing fake feet into the dirt. Murphy pulled me aside. "There's more, Jimmy. Got similar reports from 2 other ranches this week. All the same. Livestock killed and arranged. All the same tracks. Whatever's doing this, it's got a hunting range of about 30 square miles." "That includes a big chunk of my forest," I said, "which is why I called you. I've got 3 deputies in a county that covers half of Washington. I can't babysit every ranch and patrol the woods, too." But if this thing is living in the national forest, I'll keep an eye out, I promised. But as I drove back into the woods that afternoon, Rex whimpering in the back seat and those impossible tracks burned into my memory. I had a feeling that keeping an eye out wasn't going to be enough. Something was hunting in my forest, something that could think and plan and arrange its kills like trophies. The old-timers used to tell stories about things that lived deep in the woods. Loggers would talk about the dogmen when they'd had a few drinks, creatures that walked like men but hunted like wolves. I'd always figured those were just stories to scare the new guys. Maybe I was wrong. 3 days later, I found the first real evidence that we were dealing with something beyond any normal predator. I was doing my regular patrol of the backcountry trails when I noticed Rex acting strange. He kept looking over his shoulder and whining, something I'd never seen him do. Rex was a brave dog. I'd seen him face down black bears without backing down. But now, he was scared. The trail we were on wound through thick timber toward an old fire lookout station about 12 miles from the nearest road. It was one of my favorite spots to check because hikers rarely made it that far back. Too much work for most people. But that morning, the forest felt wrong. The birds had stopped singing. In 17 way. Years of walking these woods, I'd learned to read the forest's moods. When the birds go quiet, something's not right. Could be a storm coming or a predator on the move. But the sky was clear, and the air was still as death. About 2 miles from the lookout, I found the campsite, or what was left of it. The tent was shredded but not randomly torn like a bear would do it. The rips were precise, like someone had used a very sharp knife. The backpack was emptied, but nothing was taken. Not the food, not the equipment. Everything was just scattered around like whoever did this was looking for something specific. "Hello?" I called out. "Forest Service. Anyone here?" No answer. But Rex started growling, low and steady. He was looking at something behind the destroyed tent. I found the hiker about 50 yards into the woods. What was left of him? I'd seen death before. Car accidents, hunting mishaps, heart attacks on the trail. But this was different. This was personal. The body had been dragged away from the camp, and like the cattle, it was arranged. Arms folded across the chest, eyes closed, almost respectful if you ignored the bite marks on the throat. But the tracks around the body made me sick to my stomach. The same impossible prints from the ranch, human feet that became animal paws, dozens of them, circling the body like whatever killed this man had spent time studying what it had done. I radioed for Murphy and the coroner, then spent the next hour trying to piece together what happened. The hiker's name was David Chen, according to his wallet. 26 years old, from Seattle. His car was parked at the trailhead with Washington plates. Nothing special about him, just a young guy who wanted to spend a weekend in the woods. The attack happened at night, based on the scattered remains of his campfire. Whatever killed him was strong enough to drag a full-grown man 50 yards through thick brush without leaving much of a blood trail. That meant it carried him, not dragged him, something that walked upright. Murphy arrived with 2 deputies and the coroner around sunset. They took photos and measurements, bagged the evidence, and asked the same questions I'd been asking myself all afternoon. "Any idea what we're dealing with?" Murphy asked as they loaded the body bag into the ambulance. "No," I said. But that wasn't entirely true. I was starting to have ideas, and I didn't like any of them. The coroner was a thin, nervous man named Peterson. He'd been examining the bite marks with a magnifying glass, and his face was pale. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "these aren't made by any animal I know. The tooth spacing is wrong for a bear or cougar, too wide, too deep, and the jaw strength required to make marks like these." He trailed off, shaking his head. "What's your best guess, Doc?" Murphy asked. "A very large dog, German Shepherd size, maybe bigger, but the spacing suggests something with a longer snout. More like a wolf, but we don't have wolves in Washington anymore." I thought about that as they drove away, leaving me alone with Rex in the gathering dark. No wolves in Washington. That was true. They'd been hunted out decades ago. But what if something else had moved in to fill that empty space? Something that hunted like a wolf, but thought like a man. The walk back to my truck took an hour, and every step made me more nervous. Rex stayed close, almost pressed against my legs. Every shadow looked threatening. Every sound made us both jump. When we finally reached the truck, I found something that made my blood freeze. Scratches in the paint, deep gouges that ran along both sides of the vehicle, about shoulder height for a tall man. But these weren't made by fingernails. They were made by claws, long, sharp claws that bit deep into the metal. Whatever had done this was sending me a message. We know where you are. I drove home that night with my pistol on the seat beside me and Rex panting nervously in the bow. Cock! But it wasn't until I was safely inside my cabin with all the doors locked that I allowed myself to think about what the coroner had said. A wolf-like creature with a jaw strong enough to crush a man's throat. Something that walked on 2 legs but could run on 4. Something smart enough to stalk its prey and arrange its kills. The old logger stories called them dogmen, half wolf, half human, all predator. I'd always thought they were just tales to scare greenhorns around the campfire. But as I sat in my kitchen that night, cleaning my pistol and checking the locks for the 3rd time, I started to wonder if maybe the old-timers knew something I didn't. Rex wouldn't leave my side all night. Every time I got up, he followed. When I went to bed, he curled up on the floor right next to me instead of his usual spot by the door. Smart dog. He could sense what I was just starting to understand. We were being hunted. The attacks came in waves over the next week, each one more bold than the last. Tuesday morning brought news of another ranch hit. The Morrison place, about 15 miles north of Hendricks. Same pattern. Livestock killed and arranged, those impossible tracks circling the scene. But this time there were 3 different sets of prints. Whatever we were dealing with, it wasn't working alone. Wednesday, a family camping at Bear Creek found their food cache torn apart and their car tires slashed. The husband swore he saw something watching them from the tree line, something tall that walked on 2 legs but moved wrong, like it wasn't used to standing upright. Thursday brought the 2nd death. Lisa Warren was a wildlife photographer from Portland who'd been documenting the drought's effect on forest animals. She was experienced, careful, and smart enough to camp in the designated areas and follow all the safety rules. I found her camera first. It was hanging from a branch about 8 feet off the ground, undamaged but covered in what looked like saliva. When I developed the film later, the last photos showed something that made my hands shake. The pictures started normal. Deer drinking at a stream, a hawk circling overhead, shots of the dry underbrush. But the final frames showed something else. A shadow moving between the trees. Then a clearer shot of something large and dark watching from behind a fallen log. The last photo was taken at night, probably triggered by movement. It showed eyes. Bright, intelligent eyes reflecting the camera flash. But they were too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal, and too far apart to be human. I found Lisa's body a quarter mile from where the camera was hanging. Like David Chen, she'd been carried away from her camp and arranged with almost ceremonial care. But this time, there were signs of a struggle. Deep gouges in nearby trees, as if she'd tried to climb to safety. Scattered gear marked her desperate attempt to escape. The tracks told the story. She'd been stalked for hours. Multiple sets of prints surrounded her campsite, moving in the same circling pattern I'd seen before. They'd waited until she was asleep, then moved in fast. But Lisa Warren had been tough. The broken branch in her hand and the blood under her fingernails showed she'd fought back. There were patches of coarse fur caught on the bark of several trees, dark gray and longer than any dog breed I knew. Murphy arrived with a full forensics team this time. The state police were getting involved, and there was talk of bringing in specialists from the university. "This is getting out of hand, Jimmy," Murphy said as we watched the crime scene techs work. 2 people dead in a week, multiple livestock kills, and we don't even know what we're hunting. "I think I do," I said quietly. I told him about the old logger stories, about creatures that were neither fully human nor fully animal. Murphy listened without interrupting, his face getting more skeptical with each word. "Come on, Jimmy. Dogman. That's folklore. Campfire stories." "Then explain the tracks. Explain how something can walk upright and run on 4 legs." Explain the intelligence, the way they stalk their prey, the way they arrange the kills. Murphy didn't have an answer for that. That evening, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of going home to my cabin, I drove up to the old fire lookout station. It was a sturdy building, 30 feet off the ground with only one way up, a narrow staircase that could be defended. If something was hunting me, I wanted the high ground. Rex didn't like the idea. He whined and paced as we climbed the stairs, looking back toward the forest every few steps. But he followed, because that's what good dogs do. The lookout had been abandoned for 5 years, but the structure was still sound. Thick walls, reinforced windows, and a clear view for miles in every direction. I'd brought enough supplies for 3 days, plus my rifle and extra ammunition. If whatever killed Lisa and David wanted to come for me, let them try. I was settling in for the night when I heard the first howl. It came from the north, long and mournful, but wrong somehow. Too deep for a coyote, too human for a wolf. Rex's ears went flat against his head and he pressed himself against my legs. A second howl answered from the west, then a third from the south. They had me surrounded. I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the tree line, looking for movement. The moon was nearly full, giving me decent visibility across the open meadow around the lookout tower. For a few minutes, I saw nothing. Then a shadow detached itself from the trees. It moved like nothing I'd ever seen, sometimes upright like a man, sometimes dropping to all fours to cover ground quickly. Even at a distance of 200 yards, I could tell it was huge. Bigger than any bear, broader than any man. 2 more shadows emerged from different directions. They were coordinating their approach, showing the kind of pack intelligence that made my mouth go dry. Whatever these things were, they could plan and communicate. I turned on the lookout's emergency radio and tried to call for help, but got nothing but static. They'd probably damaged the antenna somehow. These creatures were smart enough to cut off my escape routes and my communication. As the night wore on, they got bolder. I could see them moving closer, circling the base of the tower. Rex growled constantly now, a low rumble that vibrated through his chest. His eyes never left the windows. Around midnight, I heard something that nearly made me lose my nerve. Footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate steps climbing toward the lookout cabin. But the rhythm was wrong. Sometimes 2 feet, sometimes 4. Like whatever was climbing couldn't decide how it wanted to move. I grabbed my rifle and pointed it at the door, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might give out. Rex positioned himself beside me, hackles raised and teeth bared. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. In the silence I could hear breathing, deep, wet breaths like an animal that had been running hard. Then something scratched at the door. Long, slow scratches like fingernails on wood. But these weren't fingernails, these were claws, and they were gouging deep furrows in the solid oak door. "Go away," I shouted. "I'm armed." The scratching stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then I heard something that nearly broke my mind. Laughter. Deep, rumbling laughter that sounded almost human but carried an undertone of animal satisfaction. Whatever was outside the door understood me. It knew I was afraid, and it was enjoying itself. The attack on the door started a few seconds later. The door held for about 10 minutes. These weren't mindless animals throwing themselves against the wood. They were methodical, intelligent. I could hear them working together, one creature holding something steady while another used it as a lever. The sound of splintering wood got louder with each passing second. "There's got to be another way out," I muttered, scanning the small lookout cabin. Rex pressed against my legs, trembling but ready to fight. The windows were too small to climb through, and it was a 30-foot drop to the ground anyway. The radio was still dead. I had my rifle, a pistol, and maybe 50 rounds of ammunition. If there were only 3 of them, I might have a chance. The door frame cracked with a sound like a gunshot. Through the growing gap, I caught my first clear look at what had been stalking me for weeks. The creature's head appeared in the opening, massive, wolf-like, but with human intelligence burning in those yellow eyes. Its snout was longer than any dog's, filled with teeth designed for tearing flesh. But it was the hands that made me nearly sick with fear. Human hands, long fingers tipped with claws, but unmistakably human in shape. Hands that could use tools, that could plan, that could open doors. I put 3 rifle rounds center mass before it could squeeze through the doorway. The creature stumbled backward with a snarl of rage and pain, but it didn't go down. Dark blood splattered the stairs, and I heard it retreating, but not fleeing, just regrouping. The howls that answered my gunshots were different now, angry, coordinated. I'd hurt one of them, and the pack wasn't happy about it. The next assault came from 2 directions at once. While one creature continued working on the door, another started tearing at the roof. I could hear claws ripping through the tar paper and wooden shingles like tissue paper. Rex barked once, sharp and urgent, looking up at the ceiling. A section of roof boards sagged inward, and dust rained down on us. I fired several rounds through the ceiling, hoping to discourage whatever was up there. The sound stopped for a moment, then resumed with increased worry. These things were determined to get inside, and they had the strength and intelligence to succeed. That's when I smelled smoke. At first I thought it was from my gun barrel, but the scent was too strong, too widespread. I looked out the window and saw an orange glow flickering between the trees. They'd set fires. Multiple fires positioned to drive me out of the lookout and into the open. The smoke was getting thicker by the minute. In this drought, the forest would go up like gasoline. They were using fire as a weapon, just like humans would. The door finally gave way with a crash that shook the entire structure. The wounded creature squeezed through the opening, blood matting its dark fur, but fury burning in its eyes. Up close, it was even more terrifying than I'd imagined. 8 feet tall when it stood upright, with shoulders broad enough to fill the doorway. Its face was a nightmare fusion of wolf and human features, intelligent but utterly predatory. I emptied my rifle into its chest. At that range, the bullets should have dropped it instantly. Instead, it staggered but kept coming. These things were tougher than any normal animal had a right to be. The creature lunged for me with those terrible human hands extended. Rex launched himself at its throat, 40 pounds of loyal German shepherd determined to protect his human. The impact knocked the creature sideways, and for a moment, the small cabin erupted into chaos, snarling, growling, the crash of breaking furniture. Rex fought like a demon, but he was outweighed by 200 pounds. The creature's claws raked across his ribs, opening deep wounds that painted the floor with blood. But my brave dog hung on, teeth locked on the thing's throat, buying me precious seconds to reload. I got the pistol out and put 6 rounds into the creature's head from point-blank range. That finally did it. The thing collapsed backward, taking Rex with it in a tangle of fur and limbs. "Rex!" I dropped beside my dog, hands shaking as I checked his wounds. Deep gashes across his chest and flanks, but he was sound, still breathing. Still alive. The smoke was getting thicker. Through the windows, I could see flames climbing the trees around the lookout station. The other creatures had set a ring of fire, trapping me in a burning forest with only one way out, down the stairs and into their waiting claws. A crash from above told me the roof was giving way. The second creature dropped through the hole it had torn, landing in a shower of burning debris. This one was even larger than the first, with scars across its muzzle that spoke of many fights. The pack leader. Rex tried to struggle to his feet, but collapsed with a whimper. He'd given everything to protect me, and now it was my turn. The alpha studied me with those intelligent yellow eyes. It wasn't rushing in like the first one. This creature was smart enough to learn from its packmate's death. It circled slowly, looking for an opening, while flames licked at the walls around us. I had maybe 10 bullets left between the rifle and pistol. The creature was wounded. I could see fresh blood on its left shoulder, but still very much a threat. The smoke was getting thick enough to make my eyes water and my lungs burn. "Come on, then," I whispered, raising the rifle. "Let's finish this." The alpha feinted left, then lunged right with blinding speed. I got off 2 shots before it hit me, driving us both backward through the window in an explosion of glass and splintering wood. We fell 30 feet to the forest floor, the creature's body cushioning my landing, but its claws raking across my back as we hit. I rolled away, gasping for breath, as the alpha climbed slowly to its feet. The fall had hurt it more than me. One back leg wasn't supporting its weight properly, but it wasn't giving up. None of them were giving up. The third creature emerged from the burning forest, moving to flank me while its wounded leader held my attention. I is down to my pistol in maybe 6 rounds. Rex was trapped in the burning lookout above us. The fires were spreading fast and my truck was parked a half-mile away through dense forest. That's when Rex made his choice. I heard him barking from the lookout. Not the warning bark he'd been using all night, but something different, sharper, more urgent. He was trying to tell me something. The third creature looked up at the sound, distracted for just a second. That's when Rex jumped. 40 pounds of injured German shepherd launched himself through the burning window, landing squarely on the third creature's back. The impact drove both of them to the ground, and I used that moment to put 3 bullets into the alpha's chest. The pack leader went down hard, yellow eyes going dim as its life bled out onto the forest floor. But Rex paid the price for his sacrifice. The third creature's claws had found his throat during their fall. By the time I put it down with my remaining bullets, my faithful partner was already gone. The forest fires were spreading fast now, consuming the dry timber with terrifying speed. I had maybe minutes before the whole area became an inferno. I gathered Rex's body in my arms and started the long run back to my truck, tears streaming down my face from smoke and grief. Behind me, the fire consumed everything: the lookout station, the bodies of the creatures, and any evidence of what had really happened that night. I made it to my truck with seconds to spare, the flames licking at my heels as I drove away from the burning forest. The official report called it a wildfire caused by extreme drought conditions and possible lightning strike. The 2 human deaths were attributed to the fire, their earlier injuries explained as burns and smoke inhalation. The livestock kills were blamed on feral dogs that had probably died in the flames. I didn't argue with any of it. Sheriff Murphy visited me in the hospital while they treated my burns and claw marks. He sat by my bed for a long time without saying anything, just looking at the bandages that had covered most of my back and arms. "Hell of a thing," he finally said. "You're lucky to be alive." "Lucky," I repeated. Lucky wasn't the word I'd have chosen. "The Forest Service is calling you a hero, running into a forest fire to try to save those campers." I almost laughed, but it hurt too much. "Is that what they think happened?" Murphy's eyes met mine. "That's what the report says happened. Sometimes that's enough." But he knew. I could see it in his face. He'd seen the same evidence I had, walked the same crime scenes. He just couldn't say it out loud any more than I could. I retired 2 weeks later. 17 years of service, and I walked away without looking back. Sold my cabin, moved to Seattle, got a job doing security for an office building. Nothing exciting, nothing dangerous, nothing that required me to go into dark places where things might be watching from the shadows. The nightmares lasted for months. I'd wake up hearing Rex barking, or the sound of claws on wood, or that terrible laughter from outside the lookout door. The doctors said it was trauma from the fire, and I let them think that. But I knew the truth. I'd looked into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist, something that thought like a human, but hunted like a wolf. Something that could use tools and coordinate attacks and set fires to trap its prey. 3 months after the fire, I got a call from Murphy. They'd found more livestock kills near the national forest boundary. Same pattern, same impossible tracks. The pack had survivors, or maybe there had been more than 3 all along. "Thought you should know," Murphy said, "in case you ever planned on coming back." "I won't," I told him, and I meant it. A year later, I heard they'd brought in a new ranger to replace me. Young guy named Peterson, fresh out of forestry school and eager to make his mark. I thought about calling him, warning him about what might be waiting in those woods. But what would I say? That monsters were real? That there were things in the forest that could think and plan and kill with human intelligence, but animal savagery? Instead, I did the next best thing. I wrote this account and sent it to him with a simple note. If you ever hear stories about dogmen, take them seriously. Never go to Coffin Rock alone, especially during the new moon. And if your dog starts acting nervous, trust him. Dogs know things we don't. I don't know if he believed it. I don't know if anyone would. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling through the city streets, I think about those creatures still out there in the forest, still hunting, still learning, still getting smarter. And I remember the way that alpha looked at me in those final moments, not with animal rage, but with something far worse, understanding. It knew exactly what it was doing when it killed those people. It enjoyed the hunt, the stalking, the terror it created. These weren't just predators following instinct. They were something new, something that combined the worst aspects of both human and animal nature. The Forest Service can call it a wildfire. The sheriff can blame feral dogs. The newspapers can write it off as tragic accidents. But I know what I saw. I know what killed David Chen and Lisa Warren and tried to kill me. And God help me, I know they're still out there. Rex died protecting me from something the world isn't ready to believe in. The least I can do is make sure someone knows the truth, even if they think I'm crazy for telling it. My name is James Whitmore. I was a forest ranger for 17 years. And I'm telling you now, stay out of those woods after dark. Some things are better left alone in the deep places where they belong, but they won't stay there forever. They're learning, they're adapting, and they're getting hungry. My name is Patricia Montgomery, and I've been a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains for 13 years. People call me Ranger Pat. Before this job, I taught third grade for 10 years, so I know kids pretty well. I thought I did anyway. It was a cool September morning in 1976 when everything changed. The mist hung low in the valleys like cotton balls, and the leaves were just starting to turn yellow and red. I was drinking my coffee at the visitor center when the Hendersons walked in, looking worried. "Ranger Pat, we need to talk to you," Mrs. Henderson said, holding her 6-year-old daughter's hand tight. "Something strange happened yesterday." I set down my coffee cup. "What's wrong?" "Well, we were hiking the trail to Cataract Falls, and Jenny here started talking to some other children. At first we thought it was nice, making friends. But when we looked closer, there was nobody there." Jenny tugged on her mom's sleeve. "There were 2 kids, Mama. They wanted me to come play by the water." Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. "The thing is, this happened to another family last week, the Pattersons. Their boy Tommy said the same thing. Kids by the water who disappeared when adults got close." A cold feeling crept up my neck. In 13 years, I'd never heard anything like this. Sure, kids have big imaginations, but 2 different families. "Where exactly did this happen?" I asked. "Down past the falls, where the trail gets narrow. There's a small lake back there in the trees. Real pretty place, but kind of lonely feeling." I knew the spot. Lost Lake, the old-timers called it. Most visitors never found it because it was off the main trail. I'd been there maybe 3 times in all my years working here. "I'll check it out today," I promised them. Probably just some local kids playing where they shouldn't be. But even as I said it, something felt wrought. Ning. After the family left, I pulled out my trail maps and found the path to Lost Lake. It wound through thick woods for about 2 miles past Cataract Falls. The lake itself was small, maybe 50 yards across, fed by an underground spring that kept the water dark and cold even in summer. I packed my day bag with the usual stuff: first aid kit, radio, water, energy bars. Then I added something I'd never carried before: a small notebook. If I was going to investigate this, I wanted to write everything down. The hike started normal enough. Families were already on the main trail, heading to see the waterfall. Kids laughed and pointed at squirrels. Parents took pictures. Everything felt safe and happy. But as I turned onto the narrow path toward Lost Lake, the sounds faded. The trees grew thicker, blocking out most of the sunlight. My boots made soft crunching sounds on the fallen leaves, but otherwise it was quiet. Too quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. Even the insects seemed to have gone somewhere else. I checked my watch. It had taken me 45 minutes to reach the lake. The water stretched out before me, dark as coffee, with mist rising from the surface. Pine trees grew right up to the water's edge. their branches hanging low like they were trying to hide something. It was beautiful, I had to admit. But Mrs. Henderson was right about the lonely feeling. This place felt forgotten. I walked around the shoreline looking for signs that kids had been playing here. No footprints in the soft mud, no candy wrappers or toys left behind. Nothing. Then I saw them. 3 objects sitting on a flat rock near the water's edge, arranged in a neat little row. A wooden doll with a faded dress, a small metal toy car that looked really old, and a baseball card still in good shape. My hands shook as I picked them up. The doll was hand-carved, the kind you might see in a museum. The toy car had 1923 stamped on the bottom. The baseball card was from 1954. Kids didn't play with toys like these anymore, and they sure didn't arrange them so carefully and just leave them behind. I wrote everything down in my notebook, drew a little map of where I found the objects. Then I sat on the rock and tried to think. What kind of kids had toys from the 1800s, the 1920s, and the 1950s? The answer that came to me made no sense at all. But as I sat there in that quiet, lonely place with the mist swirling over the dark water, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Someone small. I should have left those toys where I found them. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark lake and felt those invisible eyes watching me. I kept thinking about what Jenny Henderson had said. They wanted me to come play by the water. The next morning, I drove into town to visit the library. Miss Clara, the librarian, had lived in these mountains her whole life. If anyone knew the history of Lost Lake, it would be her. Lost Lake? Miss Clara's face went pale. Honey, why are you asking about that place? I told her about the families and the strange toys. She listened without saying a word, then got up and walked to a filing cabinet in the back room. I was hoping nobody would ever ask about this, she said, pulling out a thick folder, but I suppose you need to know. She opened the folder and showed me old newspaper clippings, some so yellow they looked ready to crumble. The oldest one was dated March 15th, 1838. Cherokee families forced from homes, the headline read. Below it was a smaller story. Local Cherokee children reported missing during forced removal. Families claim children hid in mountain caves rather than face march to Oklahoma Territory. Search parties found no trace. Miss Clara turned the page. This one's from 1923. Mountain Lake claims young life. The story told about a 7-year-old boy who drowned while his family was camping. His body was never found. And this, she said, showing me a 1954 clipping. Another drowning, a little girl this time. Same lake. My mouth went dry. How many children have died at Lost Lake? Nobody knows for sure. The Cherokee families wouldn't talk about it after the removal. Too much pain. But the drownings keep happening every few decades. Always children, bodies never found. She closed the folder and looked at me seriously. Pat, my grandmother was half Cherokee. She told me stories about that lake. Said the children who died there are still waiting. Waiting for what? For other children to join them. I left the library with my head spinning. Ghost stories were just mountain folklore, I told myself. There had to be a logical explanation. But that afternoon I got a radio call that made my blood run cold. Ranger Montgomery, we need you at the visitor center right away. We have a missing child. I raced back to find chaos. The Pattersons, the family Mrs. Henderson had mentioned, were crying and shouting at my supervisor. Their 8-year-old son, Tommy, was gone. He was right beside us on the main trail, Mrs. Patterson sobbed. We stopped to take a picture of the waterfall. When we looked around, he was gone. Which direction? I asked. We don't know. We called and called, but... She broke down again. I organized a search party. 12 volunteers spread out along the main trail while I took the path toward Lost Lake. Something told me that's where I'd find Tommy. The hike felt different this time. The silence was deeper, more complete. Even my radio crackled with static. But worse than the quiet was the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every few steps I'd turn around, sure someone was following me. Nobody there. I reached Lost Lake just as the sun was setting. The water looked black now, and mist was rising thick from the surface. "Tommy," I called. "Tommy, are you here?" Then I heard it. A voice, high and sweet, singing something I didn't recognize. The words weren't English. They sounded old. I followed the sound around the lake. The singing got louder, and I realized it wasn't just one voice. It was several children singing together. "Tommy, is that you?" The singing stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard a small voice call out, "Help me! I can't get out!" The voice was coming from the water. I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward the sound. The beam cut through the mist, and I saw him. Tommy Patterson standing waist-deep in the lake about 20 feet from shore. "Tommy! Stay where you are! I'm coming!" But as I got closer, something was wrong. Tommy wasn't struggling. He wasn't shivering, even though the water had to be freezing. He was just standing there, staring at something I couldn't see. "Tommy, what are you looking at?" He turned toward my voice, and his eyes were different, distant, like he was in a dream. "The other kids want me to play with them," he said in a voice that didn't sound quite right. "They've been waiting so long to have a friend." That's when I saw them. 3 small shapes in the mist, standing in the water behind Tommy. They were pale and wet, with dark, hollow eyes. One was a little girl in an old-fashioned dress. One was a boy in clothes from the 1920s. One wore a Cherokee traditional shirt. They were holding hands, and they were trying to get Tommy to join their circle. "Tommy, listen to me," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You need to come toward my voice right now." "But they're my friends," he said. "They want to show me something underwater, something special." The 3 ghost children smiled, and when they did, their mouths opened too wide, showing rows of water-stained teeth. I didn't think. I just ran into that freezing lake and grabbed Tommy's arm. The moment I touched him, the singing started again. But this time, it was angry. The water around us began to churn. The ghost children's faces changed, becoming twisted and hungry. They reached for Tommy with fingers that looked more like claws. I pulled as hard as I could, dragging Tommy toward shore. He fought me at first, but as we got out of the water, he suddenly came back to himself. "Ranger Pat, what happened? Why am I all wet?" Behind us, the singing grew louder and more desperate. But when I looked back, the lake was empty. Tommy's parents cried and hugged him when we got back to the visitor center. They wanted to know what happened, but how could I explain? I wrote in my report that the child had wandered off trail and fallen in the lake. Hypothermia can cause confusion, I said. But I kept thinking about those 3 faces in the mist, and I knew they weren't done trying to make friends. I should have closed that trail, should have put up barriers and warning signs. But who was going to believe me? "Sorry, folks. Can't go to Lost Lake because it's haunted by dead children." Instead, I did the only thing I could. I started patrolling that area every day, hoping to keep families away from the lake. It didn't work. Over the next 2 weeks, 5 more children reported seeing friends in the woods who disappeared when adults came near. Each time the sightings were closer to Lost Lake. Each time the children seemed more confused afterward, like they couldn't quite remember what had happened. Then came the morning that changed everything. My nephew David was visiting from Nashville. He was 9 years old, curious about everything, and excited to spend a week with his cool aunt, who was a park ranger. His parents had dropped him off the night before, and I'd promised to show him the best hiking trails. "Can we see some bears, Aunt Pat?" he asked over breakfast. "Maybe," I said, "but we have to be careful and quiet." I planned a safe route that would take us away from Lost Lake. We'd hike to the regular waterfall, have lunch by the stream, and be back by afternoon. Nothing dangerous about it, but I should have. V remembered that 9-year-old boys don't always follow the plan. We were having lunch by Cataract Falls when David jumped up and pointed into the trees. "Aunt Pat, look! There are kids! Over there!" I looked where he was pointing. Through the trees, maybe 50 yards away, I could see 3 small figures standing in a patch of sunlight. They were too far away to make out clearly, but something about the way they stood, perfectly still, watching us, made my skin crawl. "David, Stay close to me." "But they're waving. Look, they want us to come play." Before I could stop him, David ran toward the trees. I chased after him, crashing through the underbrush, my heart pounding. The figures were gone when I reached the spot, but David was standing there with a strange smile on his face. "They went that way," he said, pointing deeper into the woods. "They said they know a secret place, a lake where we can swim and play games." "David, we're going back right now." "But Aunt Pat, now!" Something in my voice must have scared him because he followed without arguing. But as we hiked back to the main trail, I could feel eyes watching us. When I looked over my shoulder, I saw 3 small shapes keeping pace with us through the trees, always staying just far enough away to seem like shadows. That night, David had nightmares. He kept talking in his sleep about going to play with the water children. I sat by his bed all night, afraid to close my eyes. The next morning, I knew I needed help. I drove to the Cherokee Reservation just outside the park and asked to speak with someone who knew the old stories. They sent me to Joseph Crow Feather, an elder who was almost 80 years old. He listened while I told him everything: the toys, the missing children, the ghosts in the lake. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "My great-grandmother told me about that place," he finally said. "During the removal, some Cherokee families hid their children in the mountains rather than see them march to Oklahoma. They thought they were saving them." "What happened?" "Wet. Winter came early that year. Food ran out. The children—" He shook his head sadly. "They went to the lake for water and never came back. Their spirits are trapped there, angry and lonely. They want other children to join them so they won't be alone anymore." "How do I stop them?" "You can't stop them, but you might be able to help them find peace." He went into his house and came back with a small leather pouch. "This is cedar and sweetgrass, blessed in the old way. If you burn it by the lake and speak to them with respect, they might listen." "What do I say?" "Tell them their families love them. Tell them it's time to go home." I took the pouch, but Joseph caught my hand before I could leave. "Be careful," he said. "They've been waiting almost 150 years. They won't give up easily." He was right. That afternoon, David disappeared. I'd left him at the visitor center with my supervisor while I went to patrol the trails. When I came back, the office was empty except for a note on my desk. "Gone to play with my new friends at the secret lake. Don't worry, Aunt Pat. They promised to show me something amazing underwater." My hands shook as I read it. David didn't know about Lost Lake. I'd never told him the name or how to get there, but somehow he'd found the way. I grabbed the leather pouch Joseph had given me and ran for my truck. The drive to the trailhead took forever. Then the hike seemed to take even longer. Every step, I was terrified I'd be too late. When I reached Lost Lake, the water was perfectly still. Too still. No ripples, no movement at all. It looked like black glass. David was standing on the far shore, staring out at the water with that same dreamy expression Tommy Patterson had worn. But he wasn't alone. The 3 ghost children stood beside him. They looked more solid now, more real. The little Cherokee girl had her hand on David's shoulder. The boy furrowed. The 1920s was whispering something in his ear. The girl in the old dress was pointing at something under the water. "David," I called. "Step away from the water." He turned toward me, but his eyes were blank. "Hi, Aunt Pat. Look at my new friends. They're going to show me where they live." "David, those aren't your friends. They're trying to hurt you." The ghost children's heads snapped toward me. Their faces twisted with anger, and suddenly the temperature around the lake dropped 20 degrees. Frost began forming on the grass at my feet. "He wants to come with us," the Cherokee girl said, her voice like wind through dead leaves. "He wants to play forever." "We've been so lonely," added the boy. "So cold." "Just one friend," whispered the girl in the dress. "Just one, and we'll be happy." The water in the lake began to move, forming whirlpools and waves despite the lack of wind. I could see shapes moving beneath the surface, dozens of them, reaching upward. "David, you need to come to me right now." But he was already walking toward the water. I ran around the lake, fumbling for the leather pouch. The ghost children saw what I was doing, and their angry whispers became screams that hurt my ears. David stepped into the lake. The water was up to his knees now. I lit a match and set fire to the cedar and sweetgrass. Sweet smoke began rising into the air. "Stop!" I shouted at the ghost children. "I know who you are. I know you're hurting." They paused, surprised. David was waist deep now, the same place Tommy had been. "Your families loved you," I said, my voice shaking. "They were trying to protect you. They never wanted you to be alone and angry." The Cherokee girl's face softened slightly. "They left us." "They didn't want to. They were forced to leave. But they loved you so much that they've been grieving for you all these years." The boy from the 1920s looked confused. "But we're so cold, so lonely." "I know," I said, "but taking other children won't fix that. It will only create more sadness." David was chest deep now. In a few more steps he'd be underwater. "Please," I begged, "let him go. Let all of this end." The girl in the old dress was crying now, tears that looked like lake water running down her pale cheeks. "We just wanted friends," she whispered. "I know. But this isn't the way." The sacred smoke from the burning herbs swirled around the lake. For a moment, everything was still. Then David blinked and looked around in confusion. "Aunt Pat, why am I in the water? It's really cold." The ghost children looked at him sadly, then at each other. The Cherokee girl nodded to the others. "Goodbye," she said to David. "Be happy." They began to fade, becoming transparent. But before they disappeared completely, they smiled. Not the twisted, hungry smiles from before, but the gentle smiles of children who had finally found peace. David walked out of the lake on his own, shivering but safe. Behind us, the water began to glow with a soft, warm light that rose up like mist and drifted toward the sky. When the light faded, Lost Lake was just a lake again. I could hear birds singing for the first time in weeks, but I was wrong about the peace. The next morning, I woke up to David screaming. He was sitting up in bed, his eyes wide with terror, pointing at the window. "They're back, Aunt Pat! They're back, and they're angry!" I looked where he was pointing. 3 small shapes stood at the edge of the trees behind my cabin. Even from a distance, I could see their eyes glowing with cold light. My blood turned to ice. The ceremony hadn't worked. The ghost children were still trapped, and now they were furious. David kept screaming, "They're saying mean things. They're saying I belong with them." I grabbed my phone and called Joseph Crow Feather. He answered on the first ring like he'd been expecting my call. "They came back," I said without introduction. "I was afraid of that," he said quietly. "The blessing only works if they want to find peace. But these children have been angry for too long. The hunger for companionship has become something darker. What do I do? There's another way, but it's dangerous. You have to go back to the lake at night during the full moon. Tonight. You have to face them directly and offer them what they really want." "Which is what?" "Not just any child, Patricia. They want you." My heart stopped. "Me? Think about it. You're the one who found their toys. You're the one who sees them clearly. You work with children every day. In their minds, you're the perfect companion. Someone who understands them and won't be afraid." I looked at David, who was still shaking and staring at the window. The ghost children had moved closer. I could see their faces now, twisted with rage and longing. "If I go to them, will they leave the other children alone?" "Yes, but Patricia, you understand what that means." I understood. If I gave myself to the ghost children of Lost Lake, I would join them. Forever. There has to be another way. "There is one possibility," Joseph said slowly, "but you'll need help. Bring the boy with you." "David? No, I won't risk him. Listen to me. The spirits are connected to him now. He's the bridge between their world and ours. Without him, you can't complete the final ceremony. But I warn you, if this fails, you'll both be trapped." I hung up the phone and looked at my nephew. He was 9 years old. This should be the summer he remembered for catching fireflies and roasting marshmallows, not the summer he faced supernatural horror. But the ghost children were getting closer to the house. Their whispers were so loud now that even I could hear them. "Come play with us. Come play forever." "David," I said gently, "I need you to be very brave. Can you do that?" He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "We have to go back to the lake tonight. But this time, we're going to end this for good." I spent the day preparing. More cedar and sweetgrass from Joseph, a flashlight with extra batteries, a thermos of hot coffee to keep us warm, and something else Joseph had given me, a small silver mirror that had belonged to his great-grandmother. "The spirits can't see their own reflection," he'd explained. "It reminds them of what they've lost. It might be enough to break their hold on this world." As the sun set, David and I hiked back to Lost Lake one final time. The full moon was rising, casting everything in silver light. The lake looked beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The ghost children were waiting for us. They stood at the water's edge, more solid than I'd ever seen them. The Cherokee girl stepped forward. "You came back," she said, and her voice was different now, older, more dangerous. "We knew you would." "I came to finish this," I replied. "To help you find peace." She laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "Peace? We don't want peace anymore. We want company. We want the boy. And we want you." The water in the lake began to churn. Other shapes rose from the depths, more children, dozens of them, all the ones who had been taken over the decades. They were pale and waterlogged, with hollow eyes and reaching hands. David whimpered and moved closer to me. "It doesn't have to be this way," I said to the Cherokee girl. "You were children once. You played and laughed and were loved. That's who you really are." "That was long ago," she said. "We are something else now." The ghost children began walking toward us. The temperature dropped so fast that our breath came out in clouds. I pulled out the silver mirror and held it up. "Look at yourselves," I said. "Remember who you used to be." The Cherokee girl glanced at the mirror and recoiled. For just a moment, I saw her as she had been in life. A scared little girl, lost and alone in the wilderness. "No," she whispered. "I don't want to remember." But the other ghost children had seen themselves too. The boy from the 1920s touched at his face in wonder. The girl in the old dress began to cry. "We were children," the boy whispered. "We were just children." "You still are," I said gently. "Scared, lonely children who need to go home." The Cherokee girl's anger was fading, replaced by something deeper. Loss. Grief. The terrible sadness of a child who had been separated from everyone she loved. "Our families," she said. "Where are our families?" "They're waiting for you," I said. "They've been waiting for almost 150 years. They never stopped loving you." David suddenly stepped forward. I tried to stop him, but he shook his head. "It's okay, Aunt Pat. I understand now." He walked to the Cherokee girl and took her hand. She looked down at him in surprise. "My great-great-grandmother was Cherokee too," he said quietly. "She told my mom stories about the removal. She said the children who died were the bravest of all, because they never gave up hope that their families would find them." The ghost girl's eyes filled with tears. "She said they became stars," David continued, "so their families could always see them and know they were safe." Around the lake, the other ghost children began to change. The anger and hunger faded from their faces, replaced by wonder and hope. I lit the cedar and sweetgrass again. Sweet smoke rose into the moonlit sky. "It's time to go home," I said. "Your families are waiting." One by one, the ghost children began to glow with warm, golden light. They looked at David and me with gratitude instead of hunger. "Thank you," the Cherokee girl whispered. "Thank you for helping us remember." The light grew brighter, lifting the children up like dandelion seeds on the wind. They rose higher and higher, becoming points of light against the dark sky. When the last light faded, Lost Lake was quiet. peaceful. For the first time in almost 150 years, the water was clear. I could see the bottom. The next morning, I called my supervisor and recommended that Lost Lake be closed to public access indefinitely. Environmental concerns, I told him. The ecosystem is too fragile for our regular visitors. It wasn't entirely a lie. The ecosystem had been badly damaged, just not in the way he thought. David and I hiked back to the lake one final time before his parents came to pick him up. In the clear water, we could see dozens of small skeletons resting on the bottom, finally at peace. I said a prayer for each one. "Will you tell anyone what really happened?" David asked as we walked back. Would anyone believe me? He thought about that for a moment. Probably not. What about you? What will you tell your friends? That my Aunt Pat is the bravest person I know, he said, and that some mysteries are too important to joke about. I hugged him tight. In the past week, my 9-year-old nephew had shown more courage than most adults I knew. The Park Service approved my recommendation to close the area around Lost Lake. I told them it was to protect a rare species of salamander. The trail was blocked off and warning signs were posted. But I still patrol that area regularly, just to make sure. Joseph Crow Feather visited me a month later. He brought sage and tobacco, and we performed a proper blessing ceremony for the children who had finally found peace. He also told me something that made my skin crawl. There are other places, he said quietly. Other lakes, other forests, where children went missing during the removal. The spirits you helped were just one group of many. How many others? Nobody knows. Hundreds, maybe thousands. Most have found peace on their own over the years. But some, he shook his head, some are still waiting. I think about that sometimes, late at night when I'm writing up my patrol reports. Somewhere in these mountains, other lost children might still be searching for companionship, for someone to ease their loneliness. But I also think about the 3 ghost children from Lost Lake and how they looked when the light finally took them home, the peace in their eyes, the joy of remembering what it meant to be loved. David writes me letters from Nashville. He's doing well in school, playing baseball, making friends, normal kid stuff. But sometimes his letters mention dreams about stars that look like children, watching over families and keeping them safe. I never told him what Joseph said about there being other places. Some knowledge is too heavy for a child to carry. But I keep Joseph's phone number in my wallet, just in case. And I keep the silver mirror in my patrol pack, because you never know when you might need to help someone remember who they really are. Last week, a family reported their daughter talking to invisible children near Burnt Mountain Trail. I checked it out, found nothing unusual, but I left some cedar and sweetgrass by the trail marker, just in case. Ghost stories were just mountain folklore until I heard them singing. Now I know better. Now I know that some spirits aren't looking for revenge or trying to scare people. They're just children who got lost a long time ago and need someone to help them find their way home. And sometimes, if you're very careful and very brave, you can be that someone. The mountains keep their secrets well, but they also keep their promises. The children of Lost Lake found their peace, and the lake runs clear now, reflecting stars instead of sorrow. But late at night, when the mist rises from the water and the wind whispers through the trees, I sometimes think I can still hear them singing. Not the angry, desperate songs from before, but gentle lullabies full of gratitude and love. Songs that say, "Thank you for helping us remember. Thank you for showing us the way home." My name is Elena Reeves, and I've been a park ranger for 11 years now. I work the backcountry patrol in Superior National Forest up in Minnesota, right where the boundary waters spread out like frozen fingers. It's February 1983, and I'm telling you this story because someone needs to know what really happened out there. People think being a ranger is all about helping lost hikers and fighting forest fires. But up here, in the deep wilderness where the lakes freeze solid and the trees stretch for hundreds of miles, you see things that don't make it into any report. Things that would get you laughed out of the service if you wrote them down. I'm part Ojibwe on my mother's side. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the Wendigo when I was little, this creature that lived in the deepest woods, always hungry, always hunting. She said it used to be human, but hunger and cold turned it into something else, something that could never be full, no matter how much it ate. I never believed those stories. Figured they were just old tales to keep kids from wandering off into the forest. My ranger training taught me that wilderness deaths came from exposure, dehydration, getting lost. Real things, things you could prevent with proper gear and common sense. The call came in on February 14th, Valentine's Day. 3 experienced winter campers had gone missing during the worst blizzard we'd seen in decades. The temperature had dropped to 20 below, and the wind was howling like a banshee through the pines. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio static. Last contact was 2 days ago from their emergency beacon. Signal went dead around midnight. I was gearing up when she added something that made me pause. Elena, there's something else. The last transmission mentioned screaming in the trees, said it didn't sound human. I clipped my snowshoes to my pack and hecked my emergency supplies twice. Matches, compass, knife, emergency food, sleeping bag rated to 40 below. Everything a person needed to survive in the wilderness. But as I started my truck and headed toward the trailhead, something my grandmother once told me kept running through my head. The Wendigo doesn't just hunt when it's hungry, Elena. It hunts when the snow falls deep and the nights grow long. It hunts when people are far from home and the cold makes them weak. The missing campers were the Hendersons, a family from Duluth who came up here every winter. Dad, Mom, and their 20-year-old son. They knew these woods almost as well as I did. If something had gone wrong out there, it wasn't because they made a rookie mistake. I parked at the frozen boat launch and strapped on my snowshoes. The snow was coming down steady and my breath made little clouds in the bitter air. The forest was dead quiet except for the whisper of wind through the pines. As I started down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from deep in the trees. Every now and then, I'd catch movement in my side vision, but when I'd turn to look, there was nothing but shadows and snow. 20 minutes in, I found their first campsite. They'd set up properly. Tent stakes driven deep, fire ring cleared of snow, food hung high in the trees like they were supposed to. But the tent was empty, and the fire had been out for days. What bothered me was the way their gear was scattered. Sleeping bags were torn apart, not cut or damaged by weather, but ripped like something with claws had been at them. And the smell. There was something wrong about the smell. Sweet and rotten, like meat that had been left out too long. I called out, "Henderson family, this is Ranger Reeves. Can you hear me?" My voice echoed through the trees and died. No answer. But somewhere in the distance, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It sounded like someone calling back. The voice was faint, carried on the wind, but I could swear it was saying my name. Elena? Elena. I stood perfectly still, listening. Every ranger learns to tell the difference between human voices and the tricks wind can play in the forest. This wasn't wind. "Hello," I called back. "Where are you? I'm here to help." The voice came again, closer this time. "Elena, help us." But something was wrong with it. The words were stretched out like whoever was speaking had forgotten how to make the sounds properly. And there was an echo to it, like the voice was coming from inside a cave. I followed the sound, my snowshoes crunching through the fresh powder. The tracks I was following weren't normal either. They looked human at first glance, 2 feet, walking upright. But they were too big. Way too big. And the toes were long and spread out like fingers grabbing at the ground. 30 yards from the first campsite, I found something that stopped me cold. It was Tom Henderson's winter coat, hanging from a pine branch about 8 feet off the ground. The coat was shredded, covered in dark stains that looked black against the blue fabric. Below it, the snow was packed down and stained red. I reached up and pulled the coat down. It was frozen stiff, and when I turned it over, I saw claw marks raked across the back. 4 parallel tears that went right through the heavy fabric and the insulation underneath. "Jesus," I whispered. That's when I heard the voice again. But this time it was different. This time, It sounded exactly like Tom Henderson. "Elena, thank God you're here. We're trapped. Follow my voice." I knew Tom's voice. He'd checked in with me a dozen times over the years, always polite, always prepared. But this wasn't quite right. It was Tom's voice, but the rhythm was off, like someone was playing a recording at the wrong speed. I drew my knife and held it ready. "Tom, where are you exactly? I need you to be specific." The voice came from deeper in the woods. "We're in a cave, about a quarter-mile north of the lake. Sarah's hurt bad. Please hurry." Sarah was Tom's wife. But how did whatever was using Tom's voice know I would recognize that name? I started moving north, but I kept my knife out and my eyes moving. The tracks were getting fresher, and there were more of them. Some looked human. Others looked like they belonged to something that walked on two legs but wasn't human at all. The forest was too quiet. In winter, you should still hear birds, the scurry of small animals, the crack of branches settling under snow weight. But there was nothing. Even the wind had died down. I came to a clearing where the snow was trampled flat. In the center was what was left of a fire, just a ring of blackened stones and cold ashes. Around the fire, the snow was stained with dark patches that I didn't want to think about too hard. But it was what I found next to the fire that made me understand I was dealing with something way beyond my training. Bones. Human bones. But they were cracked open, like something had been sucking out the marrow. They were arranged in a circle around the dead fire, positioned with a care that spoke of intelligence. This wasn't random animal predation, and they were fresh. The bones still had bits of frozen meat clinging to them. I keyed my radio. "Base, this is Reeves. I need immediate backup at my location. We have a situation here." Static. Nothing but static. I tried again. "Base, do you copy?" The radio was dead. Not unusual in deep woods, but the timing felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. "Elena." The voice was right behind me. I spun around, knife raised, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows and falling snow. "Elena, don't be afraid. We just want to talk." This time the voice was coming from above. I looked up and saw something that made me forget how to breathe. There was a shy ape in the branches about 15 feet up. At first glance, it looked like a person hanging upside down, but people don't hang upside down from tree branches without rope, and people don't have arms that long. The thing dropped from the tree and landed in the snow without making a sound. It was tall, taller than any human had a right to be. Maybe 8 feet, maybe more. Its skin was gray-white, like old meat, and stretched tight over bones that stuck out at sharp angles. But it was the face that broke something inside my mind. It was almost human, but the mouth was too wide and filled with teeth that belonged on a wolf. The eyes were black holes in the skull, and when it looked at me, I could feel the hunger radiating off it like heat from a fire. "Hello, Elena," it said in Tom Henderson's voice. "We've been waiting for you." I ran. Every piece of ranger training said to assess the situation, make rational decisions, follow protocol. But when you're face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something that's wearing a human voice like a mask, training goes out the window. I crashed through the underbrush, my snowshoes catching on branches and hidden roots. Behind me, I could hear it following. Not the heavy footfalls you'd expect from something so big, but a whisper-soft sound, like it was barely touching the ground. "Elena, wait. Don't run from us. We just want to be friends." Now it was using Sarah Henderson's voice, sweet and concerned. But there was something underneath it, a wet, hungry sound that made my skin crawl. I made it about 50 yards before I realized I was going in circles. The trees all looked the same, and the falling snow had covered my tracks. I stopped, breathing hard, my breath making white clouds in the freezing air. That's when I heard the other voices. "Mom, Mom, where are you?" A young man's voice, scared and lost. That would be Jake, the Henderson's son. "Elena, help me. Something's wrong with Jake. He's hurt." Sarah's voice again, but distorted, like it was coming through water. "Sarah, I can't find you. The thing is still here." Tom's voice, terrified. They were all around me now, calling from different directions. 3 voices, 3 members of the Henderson family all begging for help, but I'd seen the bones by the fire. I knew what had happened to the real Hendersons. I found a large pine tree and put my back against it. At least nothing could come at me from behind. I held my knife in one hand and fumbled for my emergency flare with the other. "I know what you are," I called out. "You're not fooling anyone." The voices stopped. For a long moment, the forest was completely silent. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze. Laughter. It started low and quiet, but it built, echoing off the trees until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was the sound of madness and hunger, and something that had been alone in the dark for far too long. When the laughter stopped, a new voice spoke. This one was different, older, rougher, like gravel in a cement mixer. "Smart girl. Your grandmother told better stories than I thought." I felt my hands start to shake. You knew my grandmother?" "Oh, yes. She used to leave offerings, tobacco and sage, sometimes a piece of venison. Very respectful. She understood what lived in these woods." Something moved in the trees to my left. I turned, and for just a second I saw it clearly in a shaft of pale sunlight filtering through the clouds. It was bigger than I'd thought, 12 feet tall at least, with arms that hung down past its knees. Its skin was stretched tight over its ribs, and I could see its heart beating underneath, black blood pulsing through visible veins. Its fingers ended in yellowed claws, and when it moved I could hear the bones creaking like old wood. But it was the smell that got to me. Sweet decay, like flowers left too long in water, mixed with something else, the wet iron smell of blood and the sauce, a bitter scent of old fear. "The Hendersons made good eating," it said, still using that gravelly voice. "But they were lean. Winter makes everyone lean. I'm still hungry, Elena. So very hungry." I lit the flare. Red light exploded around me, throwing wild shadows that danced and twisted. The thing recoiled, hissing like a cat. "Iron and fire," I said, remembering my grandmother's stories. "You don't like iron and fire." It laughed again, but there was pain in it now. "Iron hurts, yes. Fire burns. But you can't hold that flare forever, little ranger, and I can wait. I'm very good at waiting." I started moving, keeping the flare between me and the creature. I needed to get back to my truck, get to a radio, call for help. But every direction looked the same, and the thing was hurting me. I could feel it. Every time I'd try to go one way, I'd catch a glimpse of movement, hear a branch snap, smell that awful sweet rot stench. It was playing with me, like a cat with a mouse. The flare was burning down. Maybe 2 minutes left. That's when I heard the dogs. My sled dogs, Rex, Luna, and Bear, had followed me into the woods. They came crashing through the underbrush, barking and snarling. Bear, my lead dog, was a 120-pound Malamute who'd never backed down from a fight in his life. The Wendigo turned toward the sound, and for the first time, I saw something like concern in its black eyes. "Good boys," I whispered. "Get him." The dogs hit the creature like a furry avalanche. Bear went for the throat while Rex and Luna attacked from the sides. For a moment, I thought they might actually bring it down, but the Wendigo was faster than anything had a right to be. It moved like liquid shadow, and suddenly Bear was flying through the air, blood streaming from 4 parallel gashes across his chest. He hit a tree trunk with a sound that made me sick and didn't get up. Rex lasted about 3 seconds longer. The creature grabbed him by the head and twisted. The snap echoed through the forest. Luna, my smallest dog, ran. The Wendigo looked at me across the bodies of my dogs, its mouth now bloody, its black eyes reflecting the dying light of my flare. "Now," it said in my grandmother's voice, "we can talk." I should have run when Luna did. Should have dropped the dying flare and crashed through the forest, putting as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. But looking down at Bear and Rex, both of them dead because they'd tried to protect me, something inside me snapped. "You bastard," I whispered. Then I screamed it, You bastard! I charged the Wendigo with my knife raised, not caring that it was twice my size and had just killed two powerful dogs with its bare hands. All I cared about was the rage burning in my chest, hotter than the flare, hotter than any fire. The creature swatted me aside like I was a child, but not before I managed to rake my knife across its arm. Where the iron blade touched its flesh, the skin sizzled and smoked. The Wendigo shrieked, a sound like breaking glass and tearing metal. I hit the ground hard and rolled, coming up with snow in my mouth and stars in my vision. The flare had gone out when I dropped it. Now there was only the gray light of the overcast sky, and that was fading fast. Iron does hurt, the Wendigo said, examining the smoking wound on its arm. Black blood dripped into the snow, hissing where it landed. Your grandmother taught you well, but one little knife won't save you. It started toward me, moving with that liquid grace that made my skin crawl. I scrambled backward until I hit something solid, a rock outcropping that formed a small cave. Nowhere left to run. The Hendersons fought too at first, the creature said conversationally. Tom tried to protect his family. Sarah tried to shield her boy. Very touching. But in the end, they all screamed the same way. I felt around behind me, hoping for another way out of the cave, and my hand closed on something unexpected. A small bundle wrapped in leather, tucked into a crack in the rock. I pulled it out and almost cried with relief. Sage, tobacco, and a small piece of what looked like iron, or my grandmother's offerings. She knew you'd come here, I breathed. She left these for you, but she also left them for me. The Wendigo stopped moving. For the first time, it looked uncertain. I unwrapped the bundle with shaking hands. There was more than just sage and tobacco. There was also a piece of birch bark with writing on it. Ojibwe writing, in my grandmother's careful hand. I couldn't read all of it, but I recognized some of the words. Words about binding and banishment. Words about iron and fire and the hunger that never ends. You can read the old writing? The creature's voice had changed again. Now it sounded almost afraid. Enough, I lied. But I started speaking the words anyway, the Ojibwe syllables feeling strange on my tongue. I'd heard my grandmother speak them before, during ceremonies I'd thought were just cultural traditions. The Wendigo started backing away. You don't know what you're doing. Those words, they have power. I kept reading, my voice getting stronger. The iron ore in my hand was getting warm, and the sage was starting to smoke without any flame touching it. That's when the creature lunged. It came at me faster than thought, claws extended, mouth open in a scream of rage and hunger. I threw myself to the side and felt the wind of its passage, felt claws rake across my jacket without quite breaking the skin. But I held on to the bundle, kept speaking the words. The Wendigo spun around for another attack, but something was wrong. It was moving slower now, and its form seemed less solid somehow, like it was made of smoke instead of flesh and bone. No, it said in Tom Henderson's voice. Please, no. I'm so hungry, always so hungry. For just a moment, I saw something else in its black eyes. Not just hunger and madness, but pain. Terrible, endless pain. What were you? I asked, still holding the iron ore and smoking sage. Before? I was... It struggled with the words like it was trying to remember. I was lost. Winter of 1847, my family. We ran out of food. I was so hungry and the snow was so deep and It didn't finish. It didn't have to. You ate them, I said quietly. Your own family. The creature that had once been human nodded slowly. And then I couldn't stop. The hunger, it never goes away. Every winter, when the snow falls deep and people come into my woods, I have to. I kept speaking the words on the birch bark, but now they felt different. Not like a weapon, but like a prayer. A prayer for something that had been suffering for more than a century. The Wendigo was becoming translucent now, its form wavering like heat shimmer. The cold, it whispered. For so long, nothing but cold and hunger. I just want to be warm again. I reached into my pack and pulled out my emergency matches. With shaking hands, I lit the sage bundle. Sweet smoke rose up between us. Then rest, I said. Go to the fire that never dies out. Go to the place where no one is ever hungry. The Wendigo looked at the burning sage, and for the first time, its expression was almost peaceful. Yes, it said in its own voice, not stolen from any victim, but the voice of whoever it had been long ago. Yes, please. The creature stepped into the sage smoke and simply dissolved. One moment it was there, tall and terrible and hungry, and the next there was nothing but smoke and winter wind. I sat there in the cave entrance for a long time, holding the iron ore and watching the sage burn. When it was gone, I carefully rewrapped the birch bark and put the bundle back where my grandmother had hidden it, just in case. They found me 3 hours later, half frozen and delirious, about a mile from where my truck was parked. Search and Rescue said I was lucky to be alive. The temperature had up to 30 below, and hypothermia should have killed me hours earlier. Luna led them to me. She'd made it back to my truck and barked until a passing snowplow driver noticed her and called it in. Smart girl. I gave her extra treats for weeks after. The official report listed the Henderson family's deaths as exposure and animal predation. The investigators found remains that matched the family's DNA, along with evidence of scavenging by wolves and other wildlife. Everything neat and tidy, with a rational explanation for every detail. They never found the bodies of my dogs. When I went back to look for them a week later, there was nothing but clean snow and pine trees. No blood, no bones, nothing to show that Rex and Bear had ever been there. I never told anyone what really happened. Who would believe it? A century-old Wendigo killed by Ojibwe prayers and burning sage? They'd have me transferred to a desk job or, more likely, suggest I get some counseling for post-traumatic stress. But I made some changes. Every winter, when the snow gets deep and the temperatures drop below zero, I leave offerings at that cave, sage and tobacco, like my grandmother taught me. And I spread the word among the other rangers, the ones with indigenous heritage who might understand. Stay out of the deep woods during the hungry months. Don't go alone. And if you hear voices calling your name in the darkness, don't answer. Most of them think I'm just being cautious, passing on old superstitions. But a few listen. A few understand that some dangers can't be handled with standard equipment and procedure. 3 years have passed since that night. The Forest Service offered to transfer me to a warmer climate, somewhere down south where winter doesn't last 6 months and the wilderness isn't quite so wild. I turned them down. Someone needs to watch these woods. Someone needs to remember what lives in the spaces between the trees, in the dark places where hungry things wait for unwary travelers. My grandmother was right about the stories. They weren't meant to scare children from the forest. They were meant to teach respect for things older and more powerful than we like to admit exist. Last month, we had another missing persons case, a solo hiker who didn't return from a 3-day backpacking trip. When I found him, he was sitting by his campfire, staring into the flames with wide, terrified eyes. It spoke to me, he whispered when I approached. Something in the trees. It knew my brother's voice, my brother who died last year. It wanted me to follow. I helped him pack his gear and escorted him back to his car. Before he left, I gave him a small bundle of sage and told him to burn it if he ever heard impossible voices in the wilderness again. He looked at me like I was crazy, but he took the sage. That night, I drove back to the cave and left fresh offerings, just in case the hungry thing wasn't completely gone, just in case there are others. Because my grandmother taught me one more thing about the Wendigo, something I hope I never have to use. They can be created, not just born. Starvation and desperation and the choice to consume human flesh, those are the ingredients. And in a world where people push deeper into the wilderness every year, where climate change makes the weather more unpredictable and dangerous, those ingredients are easier to find than ever. I still patrol the backcountry. I still help lost hikers and fight forest fires and file my reports in triplicate. But I also listen for voices that shouldn't exist and watch for tracks that belong to nothing in any field guide. And every winter, when the snow falls deep and the nights grow long, I remember my grandmother's words. Respect the forest, Elena. It's older than you and hungrier than you can imagine. She was right about more than just the stories. Some hungers never die. They just wait in the cold and the dark, patient as winter itself, for the next lost soul to wander into their domain. But now they have to get past me first. Word count, approximately 4,200 words. My name is Marcus Thornfield, and I've been a park ranger for 14 years. I've seen plenty of things in the Olympic National Forest that would make city folks nervous. Bears that got too close to campers, hikers who got lost and spent 3 days eating berries and drinking creek water. Even found a few bodies over the years, heart attacks mostly, sometimes a bad fall. But I never saw anything that made me question what I knew about the world. Not until October 1987, when the Harrison family went missing at Bear Creek. I remember that morning clearly because the fog was thick as cotton. You couldn't see 20 feet in any direction. The kind of weather that makes even experienced hikers turn around and head home. But the Harrisons had been camping for 3 days already, and they were supposed to check out that morning. When they didn't show up at the ranger station by noon, I got worried. The Harrison family was from Seattle. Dad named Tom, Mom Sarah, and 2 kids. Little Emma was 8, and her brother Jake was 10. Tom had called me the week before to ask about good camping spots. He seemed like the careful type. Asked about water sources, weather patterns, what kind of wildlife to watch for. Not the kind of guy who'd just disappear without a word. I'd been doing search and rescue for all 14 years I'd worked these forests. Found lost hikers, injured climbers, scared kids who wandered off from their families. In all that time, I'd never lost anyone permanently. Sure, there were close calls, but everyone always came home eventually. That was my record, and I was proud of it. I loaded my truck with the usual gear, first aid kit, rope, flares, my radio. The drive to Bear Creek took 40 minutes on the logging road. The fog got thicker as I climbed higher into the mountains. By the time I reached the trailhead, I could barely see the trail markers, the camp. Ground was empty except for one site at the far end. Even through the fog, I could tell something was wrong. The blue dome tent was still there, but it looked wrong somehow, like it had been moved or shaken. I called out as I walked closer. Tom! Sarah! Anyone here? No answer. Just the drip of water from the pine trees and the sound of Bear Creek running over the rocks. When I got to their campsite, my stomach dropped. The tent was shredded. Not torn, shredded, like something with claws had ripped it apart from the inside. Sleeping bags and clothes were scattered everywhere, but they weren't dirty or wet like they'd been outside all night. They looked like they'd just been thrown around. The strangest part was the fire ring. The stones had been moved, not kicked over or scattered, but carefully arranged in a perfect circle about 10 feet wide. Inside the circle, all the family's personal items were laid out in neat rows. Tom's wallet, Sarah's purse, the kids' toys, like someone had been sorting through them. I'd never seen anything like it. I checked my radio. Base, this is Thornfield at Bear Creek. I've got a situation here. Static crackled back at me, then nothing. I tried again. Same thing. The radio worked fine on the drive up, but now it was just dead air. That's when I noticed the footprints. The prints were in the soft dirt near the creek, about 30 yards from the campsite. At first, I thought they might be from Tom's hiking boots, but when I knelt down to get a better look, my blood went cold. These weren't human footprints. They were huge, maybe 18 inches long and 7 inches wide, deeper than any human print should be, like whatever made them weighed twice as much as a normal person. The toes were long and spread out, and there were marks that looked like claws. But here's what really bothered me. They were walking upright, not on all four, just like a bear. These things were walking like a person, just much bigger and heavier. I followed the trail of prints away from the creek. They led into the thick forest where the fog was so heavy I could barely see 5 feet ahead. Every few steps, I'd find another print in a patch of soft ground or pressed into a fallen log. The prints seemed to be following an old deer trail that wound deeper into the wilderness. After about a quarter mile, I found something that made me stop cold. Scratched into the bark of a massive Douglas fir were marks about 8 feet off the ground. 4 parallel gouges, each one as long as my finger and deep enough to show the white wood underneath. Whatever made these marks was tall enough to reach that high without jumping, and strong enough to carve through bark like it was butter. I'd been in Vietnam for 2 years before I became a ranger. Saw plenty of things that scared me. But standing in that foggy forest, looking at those claw marks, I felt a fear I hadn't felt since the war. The kind of fear that tells you you're being hunted. That's when I heard the first sound. It came from somewhere ahead of me on the trail, a low rumbling noise, like a growl, but deeper. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, then stopped. I froze and listened, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat and the drip of water from the trees. I pulled out my service pistol. It felt small and useless in my hand. The trail curved around a huge fallen log, and when I came around the bend, I found the first body. It was Tom Harrison, and he was dead. He was lying on his back about 10 feet off the trail, arms spread out like he'd been thrown there. His neck was twisted at an angle that made me sick to look at. But there was no blood, no cuts or bites. It looked like his neck had just been snapped. Tom was a big guy, maybe 200 pounds. Whatever killed him had picked him up and broken his neck like he was a doll. I forced myself to check for a pulse, but his skin was already cold. He'd been dead for hours, maybe since last night. I tried the radio again. Still nothing but static. That's when I noticed Tom's rifle was missing. He'd had a hunting rifle with him. I'd seen it when they checked in 3 days ago, but it was nowhere around his body. Either someone took it or he'd lost it somewhere else. I was starting to back away from the body when I heard voices. "Help us! Please, someone help us!" It was a woman's voice, thin and scared, coming from deeper in the forest. Sarah Harrison. "Sarah!" I called back. "Where are you?" "Here! We're here! Please hurry!" I looked down at Tom's body, then into the fog where the voice was coming from. Every instinct told me not to leave him, not to go deeper into those woods. But Sarah and the kids were still alive, and they needed help. I marked the spot with my ranger hat and followed the voice into the fog. The trail got fainter as I went deeper, until I was just pushing through thick brush and fallen logs. The fog was so heavy now that I could barely see my own feet, but I kept hearing Sarah calling for help, always just ahead of me. "Keep calling," I shouted. "I'm coming to you. Hurry," her voice came back. "It's coming back." After maybe 10 minutes of crashing through the underbrush, I came to a small clearing. In the center was Sarah Harrison, sitting on the ground with her arms around her daughter Emma. The little girl was staring straight ahead with wide, empty eyes. But something was wrong with the scene. Sarah looked strange. Her clothes were clean, no tears or dirt stains. Her hair wasn't messed up. After spending the night in the forest, she should have looked rougher. "Sarah," I said, walking toward them. "Are you hurt? Where's Jake?" She looked up at me, and that's when I saw her eyes. They were the wrong color. Sarah Harrison had blue eyes. I remembered that from when she checked in. But the woman sitting in the clearing had dark brown eyes, almost black. "Thank you for coming," she said in Sarah's voice. "We've been waiting for you." The little girl, Emma, turned to look at me. Her mouth opened, and she spoke in a voice too deep for an 8-year-old. "The Watcher knows you're here now." That's when I realized I'd made a terrible mistake. I backed away from the woman and child, my hand reaching for my pistol. But before I could draw it, they were gone. Not running away, just gone, like they'd never been there at all. The clearing was empty except for me and the thick fog. I spun in a circle trying to see where they went, but there was nothing. No footprints, no sounds, no sign that anyone had been there. Just the drip of water and my own ragged breathing. That's when I heard Jake's voice behind me. "Mister, are you here to help us?" I turned around, and there was the 10-year-old boy, standing at the edge of the clearing. He looked normal. Dirty clothes, scared face, the way a lost kid should look. But after what I'd just seen, I didn't trust anything anymore. "Jake," I said carefully, not moving closer. "Where's your mom and sister?" "They're hiding," he said. "The big shadow took Dad. It's been watching us since yesterday." "What big shadow?" Jake pointed into the fog behind him. "It's tall as the trees, it has yellow eyes, and it doesn't make sounds when it walks. Mom told us to hide, but Emma started crying, and it hurt her." At least this sounded real. Jake looked genuinely scared, and his story made sense. Maybe I'd been seeing things in the fog. Maybe stress and fear had made me imagine Sarah and Emma disappearing. "Okay, Jake," I said. "Let's go find your mom and sister. Can you show me where they're hiding?" He nodded and started walking back into the trees. I followed, keeping my hand near my gun. The fog was getting thicker, and I had to stay close to see him. We walked for maybe 5 minutes before Jake stopped. "This is where I last saw them," he said. We were standing next to a huge cedar tree, easily 6 feet across. Jake walked around to the far side, and I followed. There was a hollow in the base of the tree, big enough for 2 people to hide in, but it was empty. "They were here," Jake said, sounding confused. "I swear they were here." I knelt down and looked at the hollow. There were signs that someone had been inside recently. Broken twigs, disturbed leaves. But no Sarah, no Emma. "Jake," I said, "when did you last see them?" "Just a few minutes ago. I told them I was going to look for help, and they said they'd wait here." But that was impossible. I'd seen Sarah and Emma in the clearing less than 10 minutes ago. Even if they'd somehow gotten past me, they couldn't have made it all the way back here that fast, unless I'd never seen them at all. My radio crackled to life suddenly, making me jump. "Marcus, this is Davidson. Come in." I grabbed the radio. "Davidson, where are you?" "About 2 miles from your location, following your trail. Found some strange tracks. You need to see this." Bob Davidson was another ranger, been working these forests almost as long as me. If anyone could help me figure out what was happening, it was him. "I'm at the big cedar near Owl Creek," I said. "Found Tom Harrison's body, and I've got his son Jake with me. Still looking for Sarah and Emma." "Copy that. Be there in 30 minutes. The radio went dead again. Jake and I waited by the tree, but 30 minutes turned into an hour. No sign of Davidson or anyone else. I tried calling him back, but got nothing but static. "Mister," Jake said quietly, "I think it's getting dark." He was right. The fog was so thick I hadn't noticed, but the light was definitely fading. We'd been out here all afternoon, and night was coming fast. Being lost in these woods after dark was dangerous enough without whatever was hunting us. "We need to get back to the campground," I said. "Can you find your way back?" Jake shook his head. "Everything looks the same in the fog." I pulled it out my compass, but the needle was spinning wildly. North, south, east, west, it couldn't decide where to point. I'd never seen anything like it. That's when we heard the breaking branches. Something big was moving through the forest, maybe 100 yards away. Trees were cracking and falling, like a bulldozer was pushing through them. But there was no engine noise, no machine sounds, just the crash of wood and the thud of heavy footsteps. Jake grabbed my arm. "That's it," he whispered. "That's the shadow thing." The sounds were getting closer. Through the fog, I could see trees swaying back and forth as something massive pushed them aside. Whatever was out there was at least 8 feet tall, maybe bigger. "We need to hide," I said. I pulled Jake toward a cluster of thick bushes about 20 feet away. We crawled underneath and tried to stay quiet. The footsteps got closer and closer until they were right next to us. Then they stopped. I held my breath and tried not to move. Through the leaves, I could see a pair of feet. They were huge, way bigger than human feet, and covered in dark, coarse hair. The toes ended in long, sharp claws that dug into the soft forest floor. The thing stood there for maybe 2 minutes, not moving. I could hear it breathing, slow, deep breaths that sounded almost like a person sleeping. But there was something else mixed in with the breathing. A low rumbling sound, like a cat purring, but much deeper. Finally, it moved on. The footsteps faded into the distance, and the forest went quiet again. Jake and I crawled out of the bushes. He was shaking, and I probably was too. "We need to get out of here," I said. "Now." But when I looked around, I realized we had a bigger problem. The fog had gotten so thick that I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. And without a working compass, I had no idea which way to go. We were lost in the wilderness with something hunting us, and night was falling fast. That's when I heard Davidson screaming. Davidson's screams came from somewhere to our left, maybe half a mile down, away. They lasted about 10 seconds, then cut off suddenly. The silence that followed was worse than the screaming. "Stay close to me," I told Jake, and we started moving toward where the sounds had come from. The fog was so thick now that I had to feel my way from tree to tree. Jake held onto my belt so we wouldn't get separated. Every few steps, I'd stop and listen, but all I could hear was our own breathing and the creak of tree branches in the wind. After about 20 minutes, we found Davidson. He was hanging upside down from a pine tree about 12 feet off the ground. His neck was broken, just like Tom Harrison's. But this time, there were claw marks across his chest, 4 deep cuts that went right through his ranger uniform. Jake made a choking sound and turned away. I stared up at Davidson's body, trying to understand what I was seeing. Bob Davidson was 6'2" and weighed over 200 pounds. Whatever killed him had picked him up and hung him from that tree like he was a scarecrow. That's when I noticed the other bodies. They were arranged in a circle around the base of the tree. Sarah Harrison and her daughter Emma. Both had their necks broken. Both were positioned sitting up with their backs against smaller trees, like they were watching Davidson's body hang above them. But these weren't the same Sarah and Emma I'd seen earlier in the clearing. These were real. Dirty clothes, scared expressions frozen on their faces. They'd been dead for hours. "Jake," I said quietly, "don't look up." But he'd already seen them. His mom and sister, arranged like dolls around the tree. He made a sound I'd never heard a kid make before, like something breaking inside him. I knelt down next to him. "Jake, I need you to listen to me. We're going to get out of here, but I need you to be brave. Can you do that?" He nodded, but his eyes were empty now. Shock was setting in. That's when I realized something that made my blood freeze. If Sarah and Emma had been dead for hours, then who was I talking to in the clearing? What had I been chasing through? The fog? A branch snapped behind us. I turned around and saw it for the first time. The thing was at least 9 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair that looked almost black in the dim light. Its arms hung down to its knees, ending in hands with claws as long as my fingers. The head was huge, with a sloped forehead and a mouth full of teeth that looked designed for tearing meat. But it was the eyes that really scared me. They glowed amber in the darkness, and they looked smart. This wasn't some dumb animal. It was thinking, planning, watching us. It had been playing with us all day. Jake whimpered and pressed against me. The creature tilted its head like it was listening to the sound. Then it smiled, showing those terrible teeth. I pulled out my pistol and fired 3 shots center mass. The bullets hit it in the chest, and I saw blood spray. But the thing barely flinched. It looked down at the wounds, then back at me, still smiling. That's when I remembered the flare gun in my pack. The creature started walking toward us, moving slow like it had all the time in the world. Its footsteps made the ground shake. I fumbled for the flare gun, loaded a flare, and fired it right at the thing's face. The flare exploded in a burst of red light, and for the first time, the creature reacted. It roared, a sound like a freight train mixed with a lion's growl, and stumbled backward, clawing at its eyes. "Run!" I grabbed Jake and we took off into the fog. Behind us, the creature was thrashing around, knocking down trees and roaring in pain or anger, but I knew the flare wouldn't stop it for long. We ran blind through the forest, crashing into branches and stumbling over logs. I had no idea where we were going, but anywhere was better than near that thing. After maybe 10 minutes, Jake collapsed. He was just a little kid, and he'd been through too much. I picked him up and kept going, carrying him on my back. That's when I saw the light ahead. It was the ranger station, about a quarter-mile down the mountain. We'd somehow found our way back to the main road. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, with Jake bouncing on my back and that roar echoing through the forest behind us. The creature was following us, crashing through the trees like a tank. We reached my truck just as the thing burst out of the tree line. In the headlights, I got a clear look at it for the first time. It was even bigger than I'd thought, probably 10 feet tall and covered in scars from old fights. Its left eye was burned from the flare, but the right eye was still glowing amber, still watching us. I threw Jake into the passenger seat and started the engine. The creature ran toward us, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. I floored the gas pedal and we shot down the mountain road, tires screaming on the gravel. In the rearview mirror, I could see the creature standing in the middle of the road, watching us disappear into the distance. We didn't stop driving until we reached the main highway. The official report blamed the deaths on a bear attack. That's what the sheriff decided, and that's what got written down in the files. 3 people killed by a grizzly bear in the Olympic National Forest. I tried to tell them the truth, showed them the photographs I'd taken of the footprints, the claw marks on the trees, the way the bodies were arranged. But nobody wanted to hear it. Bears can be smart, the sheriff said. They can stand on their hind legs, make them look taller, and when they're really hungry, they'll do strange things. The photographs came out blurry. The footprint casts I made looked like they could have been from a bear paw, if you squinted at them right. And the claw marks? Well, bears have claws too. Jake never spoke again. No. Teat one word. The doctor said it was trauma from seeing his family killed. They put him in a special hospital in Seattle, and last I heard he was still there. I requested a transfer the next month. Couldn't stand being in those woods anymore, knowing what was out there. They moved me to Mount Rainier National Park, where the forests are smaller and there are more people around. But I made sure to warn the other rangers before I left. Stay out of the deep forest around Bear Creek, I told them, especially when the fog is thick. There's something up there that doesn't want visitors. Most of them thought I was just spooked by the bear attack, but a few of the older rangers nodded like they knew what I was talking about. We call them the Watcher Zones, one of them said. Places where people go missing or come back changed. Been that way for as long as anyone can remember. The Native Americans used to say there were guardians in those mountains, said another. Things that protected the old burial grounds from outsiders. I never went back to Bear Creek. But sometimes when I'm working late at the ranger station, I get reports that make me think about that night in 1987. Hikers who disappear for 3 days and come back with no memory of where they've been. Campers who pack up and leave in the middle of the night claiming something was watching them. Hunters who find their deer arranged in perfect circles, like someone was sorting through them. And always, there are the footprints. 18 inches long, 7 inches wide, with claw marks at the tips. The thing is still up there, still watching, still waiting for people who go too deep into its territory. I'm 63 now, getting close to retirement. Sometimes I think about writing down the real story of what happened at Bear Creek. But who would believe it? And maybe it's better if people don't know. Maybe some secrets are meant to stay in the deep woods where they belong. But I'll tell you this. If you ever find yourself camping in the Olympic National Forest and the fog starts rolling in thick, pack up your gear and head back to town. Don't wait for morning. Don't think you can tough it out. Because there are things in those mountains that have been there longer than any of us. Things that don't like visitors. Things that watch and wait and remember everyone who enters their domain. I learned that lesson the hard way, and it cost 3 good people their lives. Don't make the same mistake I did. The Watchers are still out there,